Every world, no matter how bright it seems on the surface, carries something quieter beneath it. The world of Pokémon is no different, woven through with threads of shadow that run beneath its familiar colors and gentle music. There are moments in these games where the warmth pulls back just slightly and something older and stranger breathes through the gap. These are not the kinds of details that announce themselves loudly. They settle into the background, waiting for the player who looks twice, who reads slowly, who notices the door that leads somewhere it probably should not. And once you begin to notice them, they accumulate into something that feels less like coincidence and more like intention. And before you drift off, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this. And thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. The Pokemon series has always held a particular tenderness for its ghost types, its abandoned places, and its stories that end without resolution. What follows is a long and careful wander through the stranger corners of this world, the places where Pokemon lore turns dark without warning, where the Pokédex entries stop reading like natural history and start reading like something else entirely. Let the details come slowly, one after another, like lights going out down a long hallway at the end of the day. There is a Pokemon called Gengar, and it has been part of this world since the very beginning. Players who encountered it in the earliest games knew it primarily as a challenge, a ghost type with unsettling speed and a grin that suggested it knew something the player did not. The Pokédex entries written about Gengar across the decades have filled in the shape of what it actually is, and what they describe is not comfortable. Entries from multiple generations have suggested that Gengar hides in the shadows of people and waits. It lowers the temperature of a room simply by being present in it. Players have read for years that if a room suddenly grows cold, without explanation, it may be that a Gengar has slipped inside and settled against the wall behind you. The chill is described not as a side effect, but as a symptom, the way you might feel a fever before you see it. What makes this more unsettling is a detail that came later in the series. Certain Pokédex entries have floated the idea that Gengar was once human, that the creature smiling from the shadows might have started as a person, that something was lost or transformed along the way, and what remained was this. The entry does not explain the transformation. It does not say what happened. It simply notes the outcome and moves on, the way old records sometimes do when the full truth is too uncomfortable to commit entirely to the page. Gengar is also described in some entries as specifically seeking companionship. It does not want to simply haunt a place. It wants to find someone to be with, and the methods it uses to narrow that distance are the source of its darker reputation. It copies the shape of a person's shadow. It follows closely enough that the shadow seems to belong to the person in front of it. And when the moment is right, the Pokédex suggests it reaches out. What happens in that moment is left to the reader's imagination, which is perhaps the most effective horror device in the entire franchise. Phantump is one of the younger entries in the Pokemon world, introduced in the 6th generation, but the lore woven around it is among the oldest feeling in the entire series. The visible form of Phantump is a tree stump, dark and slightly gnarled, with a ghostly pale form rising from it, small eyes visible through a curtain of something that might be bark or might be hair. It looks like the kind of thing a child might draw if asked to imagine a ghost living in the forest. The Pokédex explains what Phantump actually is. These are the spirits of children who became lost in the forest and never found their way home. At some point, the records suggest, the lost child and the tree stump became one thing, the spirit taking root in the dead wood, as though the forest had absorbed what was left of the wandering child. The resulting creature retains something of the child it came from, a cry that sounds to some ears like the wail of a lost young person calling for someone to come find them. This description is notable not just for its darkness, but for its matter-of-factness. The Pokédex entry does not treat this as a tragedy requiring acknowledgement. It states it the way it might state a habitat or a dietary preference, and that flatness of tone is part of what makes it land so heavily. The world of Pokemon accepts that children become lost in forests and become something else, and catalogs it accordingly. Trevenant, the evolution of Phantump, adds another layer to this. Where Phantump is a lost child, Trevenant is something older and more deliberate. It is described as able to control the trees in a forest, using them to trap anyone it dislikes. Hunters and those who damage the forest find themselves unable to leave, the trees rearranging around them until the path back disappears entirely. The Pokédex notes this not as malice but as protection. The Trevenant guards the creatures living in the forest with a fierce and unrelenting care. The lost child grew into something that would make sure no other living thing could be taken away from the place it now calls home. Yamask carries one of the most quietly devastating pieces of lore in the entire series. It is a ghost-type Pokémon introduced in the 5th generation, and it carries a mask in front of its face, a pale and slightly sorrowful-looking visage with hollow eyes. The mask does not look like something manufactured. It looks like a face. The Pokédex explains this plainly. Yamask was once a human being. The mask it carries is the face it wore in its human life, preserved and carried forward after death. Yamask sometimes looks at its own mask and feels a sense of connection to the human it once was. It is said that Yamask sometimes looks at its own mask and feels a sense of connection to the human it once was. It is said that Yamask sometimes looks at its own mask and weeps. It gazes at the face that used to belong to it, the face through which it once saw the world, and mourns what was lost. This entry exists in a franchise aimed primarily at children, and that context makes it stranger rather than less disturbing. The game does not pause to acknowledge what it has just told the player. The player catches a Yamask, and the Yamask becomes theirs, and it travels in their party, carrying its weeping mask, remembering everything. None of the gameplay mechanics acknowledge the weight of what the Pokédex has described. The ghost of a human being is now level 7 and knows Astonish. Cofagrigus, the evolution of Yamask, takes the human connection in a different direction. The sarcophagus it inhabits is described as being able to pull people inside. Those who are grabbed and dragged into the golden form have been said to come out the other side as mummies themselves. What happens inside and whether the person can be recovered, the records do not say. What they describe is the entrance. The exit, if one exists, is someone else's story to tell. The Lavender Town area in the original Pokémon Red and Blue has accumulated layers of mythology over the decades since those games were released. The actual in-game content is notable on its own without any of the surrounding folklore. Lavender Town is a small settlement built around a tower that serves as a resting place for deceased Pokémon, and the music that plays there was written to feel unsettling in a way that distinguished it from every other location in the game. The Pokémon Tower itself contains the ghost of a Marowak, a mother who was killed by the villainous organization operating in the region. She wanders the upper floors and cannot be interacted with using normal means. She cannot be caught. She does not behave the way a wild Pokémon is supposed to behave. She simply moves through the space, and the player must eventually find the specific item that allows them to make contact with her and lay her to rest. What makes this particular sequence of events worth sitting with is how the game handles grief. The mother Marowak lost her life protecting her child, and her spirit remained because the loss was not yet resolved. The game does not use complicated language to explain this. It simply shows a ghost that will not leave, and gives the player the means to help her go. The moment of resolution, when she finally departs, arrives quietly, without fanfare, and the tower above becomes still. The child she protected is Cubone, and Cubone's Pokédex entries carry the weight of what happened. Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother as a helmet. On nights when the moon is bright, it cries, and the sound it makes is described as resembling the voice of the mother it lost. The skull it wears means the creature is always carrying the face of the one it could not save, and the moon reminds it of that loss every month without fail. Drowsy has been part of the Pokemon world since the first generation, a creature that resembles a tapir and is said to feed on the dreams of sleeping humans. The connection to the Baku, the Japanese mythological creature that consumes nightmares, is explicit in certain regional versions of the Pokédex, which name the Baku directly as an ancestor of Drowsy. The creature has been consuming human dreams since before the records of the Pokemon world began, which implies a long history of contact between this species and sleeping people. Hypno, the evolution of Drowsy, has gathered the darker portion of this lineage. It carries a pendulum that it swings to induce hypnosis, and the Pokédex has noted across multiple entries that the scent emanating from the pendulum is part of the process, drawing in those who catch a glimpse of the swinging motion. The creature's eyes are described as having a hypnotic quality that is difficult to look away from, and the entries caution the reader not to meet its gaze. The more disturbing entries appear in fire red and leaf green, which state plainly that there was once an incident in which a hypno hypnotized a child and led it away. The phrasing is careful, but the implication is not subtle. The child was taken. The child, the entry implies, did not come back on its own. It is described as an incident rather than an isolated event, which suggests it was notable enough to be recorded, but not unusual enough to be considered singular. In the Sevaii Islands, accessible in those same games, a quest exists that brings this lore directly into the gameplay. A young girl named Lostel is found in Berry Forest, frightened and separated from her father, and the reason she cannot leave is a wild hypno blocking her path. The quest resolves when the player intervenes and the girl is returned safely, but the game has just made the Pokédex entry experiential. It has shown the player what an encounter with a hypno that has selected a target looks like from the outside. Darkrai occupies a specific and significant space in the mythology of the Pokemon world. It is a creature of nightmares, described across its Pokédex entries as something that gives terrifying dreams to any who sleep near it. The entries are careful to distinguish between malice and nature. Darkrai does not choose to cause nightmares. It simply does. The nightmares are its presence, the way cold is the presence of winter, not a decision, but a condition. The creature is said to roam during moonless nights, and those who encounter it find their sleep overtaken by visions that do not leave even after waking. Certain entries note that Darkrai is not inherently evil, and that the Cresselia, its lunar counterpart, exists specifically to dispel the nightmares that Darkrai leaves behind. The relationship between these two Pokemon is built into the structure of the mythology, darkness and remedy bound together in the same region of the sky. What makes Darkrai's lore press harder than many others is what surrounds it in the 5th generation games. In Pokémon Black and White, a quest involving the strange house on the way to Reversal Mountain contains evidence of what Darkrai's presence can do to a person over time. A ghost of a young girl moves through the house, fragmented and distressed, searching for her parents and her pet Abra. She mentions a voice in her dreams telling her to stop searching for the Lunar Wing and to stay instead with them. The Lunar Wing she mentions is Cresselia's item, the thing that can drive away the nightmares Darkrai produces. The voice telling her to stop looking for it, to stop seeking relief, to stay in the dark instead, the evidence suggests belongs to a Darkrai that had taken hold of her sleep. The girl waited on a bridge to return the wing. The girl can no longer do anything in the state the player finds her. The accumulations of these details points toward a conclusion. The game never states directly, but makes unavoidable through arrangement. Froslas carries lore drawn from one of the most recognized figures in Japanese folklore, the Yuki Onna, a spirit of the mountains associated with snow and cold and beautiful danger. The Pokédex entries for Froslas describe it as the result of a woman who became lost in the mountains in a blizzard and whose spirit then took possession of a hollow of ice, becoming something that is neither entirely what it was nor entirely new. The transformation is not a resurrection, it is a persistence, the person gone but the cold shape of something remaining. What Froslas does with its existence is detailed in entries that grow more unsettling with repetition. It freezes living creatures that it finds beautiful or appealing, and it takes those frozen figures back to its den to arrange them as decoration. The den of a Frostlass is described as lined with these frozen figures, creatures, and beings that caught the Pokemon's attention and were preserved as a result. The word used is decoration, not trophies, not food. Decoration, as though the Frostlass is maintaining a kind of home. The entries also note that Frostlass approaches human settlements, particularly in blizzard conditions, and has been known to knock on doors. The knocking is described as a lure, a way of drawing someone outside or to the threshold where the cold can reach them. The prey it most specifically seeks, certain regional entries suggest, are men who are considered handsome. The Yuki-onna mythology from which Froslas draws has similar qualities, a beautiful and deadly figure in the snow that seeks out specific kinds of travelers and does not let them complete their journey. The Pokemon world contains locations that feel different from the rest of the surrounding region, places where the map changes texture and the music becomes something else. The old chateau in the Sinnoh region is one of the most complete versions of this, a manor house deep in Eterna Forest that has been abandoned and is now home to things that do not entirely belong to the visible world. The chateau is encountered early in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, long before the player has the means to access everything within it. A long dead building surrounded by dense trees, its interior rooms hold furniture that looks as though someone left in a hurry and never returned. The wallpaper is faded. The table is set for no one, and the ghost types that inhabit the building are not the ones listed in the routes outside. Two apparitions appear in the chateau that cannot be battled and cannot be caught. One takes the form of an elderly butler moving through a dining room, disappearing as the player approaches. The other is a young girl who appears briefly in a doorway, turns her face toward the player, and vanishes before any interaction is possible. Neither figure stays long enough to offer explanation. Neither figure offers any information about what happened in this house or who they were before they became what they now are. The question the chateau raises and does not answer is the same question most ghost stories raise without answering. What happened here? The furniture suggests a life interrupted. The ghosts suggest something left unresolved. The Ghastly and Gengar that have made the building their home may be the reason for both. The entries for the Ghastly line describe them as drawn to places of grief and tragedy, their gaseous bodies feeding on the lingering emotions of locations where suffering once occurred. The chateau has ghosts in it because something in the chateau generated the conditions ghosts require. Mimikyu is one of the most recent additions to the roster of unsettling Pokemon introduced in the 7th generation, and it has inspired a particular kind of quiet sadness alongside its horror. The creature's body is completely unknown. It has covered itself in a handmade costume constructed to look like Pikachu, stitched together from cloth and decorated with a face drawn in permanent marker. It wears this disguise constantly, and the reason it does is documented plainly. Mimikyu wants to be loved. The Pokemon world's most popular creature is Pikachu, and Mimikyu has observed this, has taken note that Pikachu receives affection and recognition wherever it goes, and has tried to manufacture the same reception for itself by adopting a similar appearance. The costume is homemade and imperfect. The smile drawn on the face is slightly wrong. The proportions do not quite match. But Mimikyu wears it anyway, hoping that the shape will be enough to earn what it wants. What lies beneath the costume has been described as something that causes harm to those who see it. A researcher who lifted the disguise to examine what was underneath fell ill with a mysterious condition and died a week later. The Pokédex does not elaborate beyond this. It does not explain what the researcher saw. It simply records the outcome. The gap between the sweet reason for the disguise and the lethal reality underneath is exactly as uncomfortable as it was designed to be. Mimikyu's Pokédex entries also note that it dislikes sunlight and hides from it whenever possible. The costume helps shield it, but the creature inside is described as sensitive to brightness, which gives the impression of something that belongs to the darker hours of the world, something that learned to mimic the things that move freely in the daylight because it cannot move freely there itself. The Pokemon world does not restrict its darker lore to ghost types alone. Certain creature designs cut across typing categories and carry histories or behaviors that press against the comfortable surface of the franchise in their own ways. Banette is a ghost type, but its origin is not death. Banette is a doll. Specifically, it is a doll that was thrown away by the child who owned it, and the doll did not accept this dismissal. The Pokédex entries describe the transformation as arising from resentment. The discarded doll, left in a trash can, or forgotten in a closet, or abandoned without ceremony, developed a grudge so intense that it animated, became mobile, became something other than what it started as. Banette now spends its existence searching for the child who abandoned it. The entries note that it sticks pins into its own body as a method of cursing the child, inflicting pain across the distance that separates them. What makes Banette particularly effective as a piece of dark lore is the relatable entry point. The child who threw away a doll is not a villain. Children throw away toys. They grow out of them, they forget them, they get new things, and the old things go in a bag to a charity or in a bin to be removed. The doll turned Banette does not understand this calculus of childhood. It understands only that it was wanted and then it was not wanted, and it has not found a way to process that transition that does not involve cursing the one who caused it. Shedinja is a Pokémon that arrives through an unusual mechanical means in the games, appearing in a player's party under specific circumstances when Nincada evolves. The creature itself is a shed shell, an empty husk left behind in the process of transformation, except that it is not quite empty. Something inhabits it, and the Pokédex entries spend considerable time describing what that something does. The hollow in Shedinja's back, visible through a gap in the shell, is described as a void that should not be looked into. The entries state plainly that any person who peers into the crack in Shedinja's back will have their soul drawn out. The soul is taken without warning, without violence, without any visible mechanism. You look into the dark space behind the shell, and what you were is no longer inside you. The entries do not describe what happens to the soul afterward or whether recovery is possible. This is presented as a fact about the creature in the same way the height and weight are presented as facts. It is not framed as a warning or as something exceptional. It is simply what Shedinja does, documented in the catalog the way everything else is documented. The player catches a Shedinja and trains it and uses it in battles, and the entry about the soul-consuming hollow sits in the information screen, unremarkable in its placement, extreme in its content. Esper, the pre-evolution of Meowstic, presents a different kind of uncomfortable lore. The creature is a small, lavender-colored cat with large, blank, fixed eyes, and the information recorded about it deals with the problem of what it contains rather than what it does to others. Esper has psychic power that it cannot control, and the eyes that seem blank are blank because the creature is spending its entire existence trying not to release what is inside it. The Pokédex describes the organs that produce and contain the psychic energy as being stuffed behind the ears, folded and coiled in a space too small to comfortably hold them. If Esper loses its concentration, or if the flaps of its ears come forward and release the pressure, what emerges is powerful enough to destroy everything within 50 yards. The entry does not state what happened to anything within 50 yards the last time this occurred. It states the capability and moves on. The image this creates is of a creature perpetually at the edge of catastrophe, maintaining a stillness that is not calm but containment. The blank eyes are not vacancy. They are focus, the entire conscious effort of the creature directed toward one purpose, keeping the pressure where it belongs. Esper is not a monster by choice or by nature. It is a vessel with too much inside it, trying very hard to not cause harm. The concept of a Pokémon that actively hunts or endangers humans appears across multiple entries and multiple generations, and the Pokémon that accumulate the most specific behavioral records around this theme are sometimes the ones that seem least threatening at first encounter. Drifloon is a small balloon-shaped Pokémon, round and pink and yellow, with dangling string arms and an expression that reads as pleasant. It floats near children and might be taken by a child for a toy balloon that has come loose from someone's hand. The Pokédex entries clarify the situation. Drifloon attaches itself to small children and carries them away. The entries use varying degrees of directness across different games, but the core description remains consistent. The creature grabs hold of children who take hold of its strings, and it does not let go, and it rises into the sky with them. Where it takes them, the entries do not say with certainty. Some versions of the entry suggest the children are taken somewhere beyond the visible world. What makes this particular piece of lore memorable is the visual. The design of Drifloon looks like a lost balloon. It looks like something harmless and cheerful, the kind of thing a child would naturally reach for. The darkness is built into the disguise in a way that feels intentional on the part of whatever process produces Pokémon, as though the species evolved specifically to exploit the pattern matching of young children who have learned that balloons are safe and friendly things. Poltergeist is a ghost type that inhabits a broken teapot, and its lore involves something less commonly addressed in the franchise, the fate of those who consume it. The creature secretes a tea-like fluid that fills the teapot it inhabits, and certain records suggest that humans have accidentally consumed this fluid, mistaking the teapot for an ordinary vessel. The Poltergeist inside is described as capable of possessing those who drink its secretions. The Pokédex entries across the 8th generation handle this with their characteristic flat tone, noting the possibility of possession as a consequence of accidental consumption, the way one might note the bitterness of a particular flavor. The victim does not know what has happened immediately. The possession develops. The poltergeist that was in the teapot is now somewhere else, and the person who drank from the teapot carries something new with them. The question of what Poltergeist wants from this arrangement is left somewhat open. Ghost types in general are described as drawn to the living, drawn to warmth and emotion and the things that animate the world, perhaps because those things are what they themselves no longer fully possess. A Poltergeist possessing a person has achieved proximity to everything a living being contains. Whether that proximity is its goal or simply a consequence of its nature is not clarified in the records. In the 4th generation games, The area known as the distortion world introduced players to a space that exists outside the normal laws of physics, a place where the ground is also the ceiling, where waterfalls flow sideways, where the Pokemon Giratina has existed in exile since a time before the games began. The lore surrounding Giratina is significant, but the distortion world itself is worth sitting with as a concept. The world exists as a mirror or reverse of the ordinary Pokemon world, maintaining some kind of equilibrium that the ordinary world requires. Giratina was banished there after displaying violent behavior in the distant past, and the exile was total, the creature sealed into a world where the rules are different and the landscape is impossible to navigate without specific guidance. Giratina adapted. It became the distortion world, and the distortion world became it, the entries suggesting a merger between creature and environment that makes the distinction between them ambiguous. The horror embedded in this is not in the monster, it is in the architecture of the punishment. A creature was sealed into a place that exists outside everything, outside ordinary space, outside ordinary time, in a reversal of reality where nothing is stable, and the creature lived there in solitude for an indeterminate length of time. The distortion world does not look like a prison because it does not look like anything from the recognizable world. That may be what makes it worse. Kadabra has carried a specific and persistent piece of lore since the original games, a claim made directly in the Pokédex that distinguishes it from the simply powerful psychic type story it might otherwise occupy. The entry states that a boy with strong psychic powers woke up one morning having become a Kadabra. The transformation happened while he was asleep. One night he was a person, and the next morning he was a Pokémon. The entry does not explain what caused this. It does not say whether the transformation was permanent, whether the person inside the Kadabra retained consciousness, whether the family of the boy had any recourse or understanding of what had happened. It states the outcome and attributes it to the psychic powers the boy possessed, as though the power itself was the cause, too strong to remain contained in a human form, and so it found another vessel. What this implies about the nature of psychic ability in the Pokemon world is quietly alarming. The entries that describe psychic-type Pokemon across generations regularly note powers that humans cannot fully comprehend or safely approach. Alakazam, the final evolution, is described as having an IQ beyond measurable ranges, a brain that processes information at speeds that reduce any human interaction to something simpler than the creature itself experiences. The boy who became Kadabra did not become something lesser. He became something that left the human form behind because the human form was not large enough. Spiritomb is a Pokemon formed from 408 malicious spirits that were bound together into a keystone as punishment for misdeeds. The records are not specific about what those misdeeds were, which allows the imagination to fill the space. 408 entities were individually responsible for actions severe enough that binding them permanently together was deemed an appropriate consequence, and the resulting fusion produced a creature that carries all of that within it. The keystone that contains them is cracked. The spirits press against the cracks. Spiritomb's face is the aggregate of all those trapped presences, a swirling mass of expressions and impulses held in place by the structure of the stone and by the seal that was placed on it 500 years ago. It remained sealed and solitary in the ground for those 500 years until a player in the 4th generation games inserted the keystone into a particular stone pillar and received a visitor. The behavior Spiritomb exhibits is consistent with what 408 bound spirits might produce. It is described as mischievous and prone to causing trouble, which understates the individual histories of what was bound inside it. The creature has no weakness to any type, or did not until later adjustments to the game's rules introduced one. 408 trapped spirits, cooperating even in their captivity, present a challenge that does not easily resolve. Chandelure is a ghost type from the 5th generation, a chandelier inhabited by flame that is beautiful in a way that makes looking away from it difficult. The Pokédex entries describe the flames burning within Chandelure as being capable of consuming the spirit of any person they touch, burning away the soul while leaving the body intact. What happens after this process is described with clinical precision. The body that remains wanders without purpose. The soul that was taken becomes part of the fuel that keeps Chandelure's flames burning. The phrase used in certain versions of the entry is that the body wanders forever. The soul is gone, burned away, contributing to the light that attracts the next person who comes close enough to see the beautiful flames. Chandelure is a trap that looks like a lamp, and the trap is perpetual. Every soul it takes makes the flame brighter and more attractive and more likely to draw in the next person, and so on. Litwick, the first form of this line, begins the process younger and smaller. Its candle flame guides lost travelers in the dark, and the entries note that those who follow a Litwick's light are gradually drained of energy, life force slowly absorbed into the candle without the traveler necessarily understanding what is happening to them. By the time the traveler realizes the path Litwick has guided them down, they may not have the energy left to find their way back. The beautiful light at the end of the hall leads somewhere, but not somewhere the traveler chose. The Pokémon world contains examples of lore that accumulates across multiple creatures into a picture that is larger and darker than any individual entry. The weather trio of the 3rd generation, Kyogre and Groudon and Rayquaza, exist as ancient forces that represent the power of the sea and the land and the sky respectively, and their history with each other is not peaceful. The records describe a cataclysmic ancient war between Kyogre and Groudon that nearly destroyed the world, stopped only by the intervention of Rayquaza. What the lore presses on is that this war was not resolved. It was interrupted. The two ancient creatures were not reconciled. They were separated, and they slept in their respective domains, and the world went on without knowing with any certainty whether that sleep would last. The devices that could wake them were kept under careful guard, and the story of the 3rd generation games turns on what happens when those devices are found by people who believe they can control what the devices summon. The horror in this mythology is not the monsters. It is the hubris. It is the recurring human certainty that power can be directed and contained once it has been located, that ancient and enormous forces will behave as designed once they have been pointed in a chosen direction. The records suggest they will not. The records suggest they never have. The ancient war is a record of exactly what those forces do when they are not contained, and the world the player walks through is the world that survived the last time. Mimikyu's backstory becomes more poignant and more unsettling in equal measure when the full context of what it is trying to do is understood. The creature is not performing. It is not using the disguise as a strategy or a hunting mechanism in the way some species use coloration or camouflage. It genuinely wants to be something that receives affection. The Pokédex entries are unambiguous about the motivation, and they are presented with a kind of straightforwardness that makes them more affecting than elaborate description would be. Researchers who have studied Mimikyu have noted that the creature becomes distressed when its disguise is damaged. A Mimikyu with a torn or tattered costume will repair it immediately, working at the cloth until it holds again. The entries note that the repairs are made out of sight of observers, as though the creature is aware of how it appears in its uncovered state and is protecting both the observer and its own chance of being approached. It knows what it looks like without the cloth, it knows what that does to people, and it chooses the costume anyway. There is a move called Let's Snuggle Forever, exclusive to Mimikyu, introduced in the 7th generation. The animation for this move shows the Mimikyu pulling its opponent under its costume. What happens there is not shown. The move is the most powerful it can access in that context, and the opponent does not emerge looking the same way it entered. The name of the move and the context of the creature that uses it create a combination that is among the most specifically crafted pieces of dark design in the franchise. The tower in Pokemon Gold and Silver, known as the Bell Tower, or the Tin Tower in some regional versions, is the resting place of Ho-Oh, the legendary rainbow bird that is described as having witnessed the tragedies of human history from above. The creature is said to appear before trainers who are pure of heart, an entry that places the trainer in the position of aspiring to something. But the backstory of the tower itself involves a fire. The original tower in Ecruteak City, the one called the Brass Tower, or Burned Tower depending on the version, was struck by lightning and caught fire 300 years before the events of the games. 3 Pokemon were trapped inside and died in the fire. Ho-Oh, watching from above, was moved by what had happened and brought the 3 back to life, and they became Raikou and Entei and Suicune, the 3 legendary beasts that roam the Johto region. The details of this event accumulate into something worth sitting with. 3 creatures died in a fire in a burning tower. A legendary Pokemon with the power to resurrect intervened. The 3 that came back are described as being infused with the nature of the disaster that killed them, Raikou carrying the lightning that caused the fire, Entei carrying the fire itself, Suicune carrying the rain that extinguished it. They run across the land and cannot be easily approached, and the records suggest they have been running since the moment they were returned to life, unable or unwilling to rest in the world that killed them the first time. Honage is a ghost type that takes the form of a sword, and the Pokédex entries that describe how it feeds are worth reading slowly. It wraps a tassel around the arm of anyone who grabs its hilt, using the cloth to drain the life force from the person holding it. The sword is designed in every visible way to be held. The hilt is the natural place a hand would go, and the moment the hand arrives, the feeding begins. Doublade, its evolution, is 2 swords, and the entries note that they coordinate their attacks with a telepathic connection, which implies a level of strategic thinking that goes beyond the instinctive. 2 creatures bound to a single purpose, communicating without language, moving in patterns that confuse and overwhelm whatever they are attacking. The image is precise and not particularly comforting. Aegislash is the final form, a royal sword and shield combination that certain entries describe as being historically used by royalty. Ancient kings were followed by these Pokemon, and the kings who possessed an Aegislash were able to command the loyalty of other Pokemon. The relationship between king and sword creature is described as mutual, but the entries do not specify what the Aegislash received in return for the service it provided. Power is offered. What comes back to the one offering it is not always equivalent. The concept of a Pokemon existing in a state between 2 conditions, neither fully one thing nor the other, appears in several places in the franchise, but is explored most completely in the case of Rotom. Rotom is an electric ghost type, whose defining characteristic is its ability to inhabit household appliances, entering ovens and washing machines and lawnmowers, and taking on properties of each in turn. The creature moves through these vessels the way something might move through a series of temporary homes. The Pokédex entries describe Rotom as curious about electrical devices and drawn to enter them. This is presented as a natural behavior rather than a developed one, suggesting that Rotom has always done this, and that the appliances are not obstacles it has learned to exploit, but environments it has evolved to explore. What this means about the nature of Rotom's consciousness, whether it is the same entity in each appliance or something slightly different each time, is not addressed. There is something in the concept of a ghost type whose most natural state involves inhabiting human-made objects that feels specific to a certain kind of anxiety about the objects we fill our lives with. The refrigerator in the kitchen, the oven, the lawn equipment in the garage, any of these might be host to something small and curious and electric, and the interaction with those objects would feel indistinguishable from the ordinary experience of using them. Rotom does not announce its presence. It simply moves in, and the appliance works, and nothing about the outside changes. Gorgeist, one of the grass ghost types introduced in the 6th generation, sings to celebrate the coming of the new year in certain regional traditions depicted in the Pokemon world. The song it sings is described as containing a curse. Those who hear the full song on the night it is sung find themselves wrapped in the creature's hair-like appendages, which reach out and draw them in. What the song itself does, whether the curse requires the full length of the melody or arrives partway through, is not specified. Different sizes of Gorgeist are documented, and each size has a distinct cry, a distinct quality to the sounds it makes. The larger the Gorgeist, the deeper the voice, and the more powerful the effect of the song it sings. The Pokédex notes that children who hear the voice of a large Gorgeist will be unable to stop crying without explanation, the sound triggering something that the children themselves cannot account for. The song and the crying and the wrapping in the dark hair that pulls things inward create a picture that is not an ambiguous one. Pumpkaboo, the pre-evolution, has a different but related piece of lore. It is said to carry wandering spirits inside its body, spirits that cannot find their way to wherever they are supposed to go next. The pumpkin form serves as a vessel for these lost souls, keeping them in transit. When Pumpkaboo finds the location where a particular spirit needs to arrive, it releases the spirit and the spirit departs. The creature is described as a guide, a carrier of the unresolved, though it is not clear what guides Pumpkaboo itself through this process, or what happens to the spirits if Pumpkaboo is not available to collect them. Beware is a normal fairy type, not a ghost type, not typically associated with the darker corners of the franchise, and its Pokédex entries use this mismatch deliberately. The creature is large and bear-like and pink, with an expression that reads as cheerful and arms that extend in what might be interpreted as an offer of embrace. The entries note that the embrace should not be accepted. Beware's physical strength is described as capable of snapping a person in half during what the creature intends as a hug. The creature is not aggressive. It is not attempting to cause harm. The entries are specific on this point. Beware likes people and Pokemon and expresses this affection through physical contact that its body is not calibrated to modulate. The damage caused by a Beware hug is not malicious damage. It is enthusiastic damage. The distinction is notable and does not make the outcome different. This particular piece of lore sits in an uncomfortable space because the enemy in the story is not an enemy. It is an excess of warmth expressed in a way that the recipient cannot survive. The entries caution against approaching Beware, note that even veteran trainers treat it with careful distance, and describe at least one incident in which a trainer was hurt accepting what appeared to be an invitation to come closer. What is offered looks like safety. What arrives is something else. Parasect is a creature that carries one of the most quietly disturbing narratives in the franchise, one that has been recognized and discussed since the earliest entries, but bears repeating because the full shape of it is worth understanding completely. The Paras line begins as a small crab-like creature with mushrooms growing on its back. The mushrooms are not symbiotic partners. They are parasites that grow more dominant with each stage of evolution. By the time Paras becomes Parasect, the mushroom has taken over. The entries note that the mushrooms have spread across the entire body and that the shell the creature appears to inhabit is now mostly controlled by the mushroom's influence. The creature's eyes, which in Paras appear alive and tracking, are in Parasect hollow and unfocused. The light behind them has gone out. The mushroom moves the body. Whatever was originally inside Parasect is either gone or no longer in control of the form it occupies. This is presented without drama in the Pokédex, reported the way a naturalist might report an observed parasitic relationship in the world outside, which is precisely how parasitism works in nature. The mushroom does not experience the takeover as violence. The mushroom experiences it as growth. What was inside the host before the mushroom arrived was not the mushroom's concern. The entries do not mourn Parasect, they describe it. The mourning, if any is done, is left to the reader. The Pokémon Tower in Pokémon Red and Blue is not the only location in the franchise where the ghosts of dead Pokémon accumulate and remain. The Distortion world in the 4th generation games contains an environment where the normal rules of passage do not apply, where the dead that have not completed their transit may linger in a space that exists outside the ordinary categories. The relationship between the Pokémon world and what comes after death is handled inconsistently across entries and games, but it returns repeatedly to the question of incompleteness. Ghost types are, in the largest sense, creatures defined by incompleteness. Something in them was not finished, something did not resolve. The Yamask carries its face because the human it was cannot accept that the face no longer belongs to it. The Phantump cries out because the child it was cannot accept that it is lost. The Froslas decorates its den because the woman it was could not accept that she had arrived somewhere she did not choose. The category of ghost type is a category of refusal, the refusal to let go of something that cannot be held. What this means in the context of a game where the player catches and trains ghost types is a question the franchise approaches carefully, and sometimes not at all. The player's Yamask weeps at its mask. The player's Phantump calls out in the voice of a lost child. These things occur during the same game where the player battles gym leaders and collects badges, and the coexistence of those registers is a design choice that says something about the kind of world the franchise inhabits, one where the ordinary and the tragic exist in the same space and are both treated as ordinary. Claydol is a ground psychic type, based on the Dogu figures of ancient Japan, clay figurines that were created thousands of years ago, and whose exact purpose archaeologists continue to debate. The Pokédex entries for Claydol describe the creature as having been a clay doll that was exposed to a mysterious beam of light from long ago and came to life. This transformation occurred so far in the past that the original creation of the doll is outside the scope of any current record, and the creature that resulted has been moving through the Pokémon world for an indeterminate time. The unsettling element in Claydol's entries is the weapon the creature possesses. Claydol fires beams from its many hands and is described as treating everything around it as an obstacle to be removed. The original Claydol was made by someone for a purpose, and the creature it became does not appear to be fulfilling that purpose in any way that the original maker would have recognized. What was made to serve has become something autonomous, something ancient, something that fires on what disturbs it without apparent consideration for what that thing is. The Dogu connection extends the discomfort. These real-world clay figures carry faces that archaeologists describe as expressive, with large goggle-like eyes and postures that suggest prayer or ritual purpose. What they were made for and what they were meant to do is not known with certainty. Claydol, in its way, inherits that mystery and populates it with behavior that answers none of the questions while introducing new ones. Runerigus, introduced in the 8th generation, is a ground ghost type that takes the form of an ancient slab covered in runes, inhabited by a spirit that was sealed into the stone through a curse. The backstory in the Pokédex describes the spirit as one that was placed in the stone through an ancient ceremony, bound there so completely that the stone and the spirit have merged over centuries into a single entity. The stone moves. The runes shift when examined closely. The entity sealed within has not dissipated. The behavior it exhibits involves pulling those who touch it into the painting on its surface. The Pokédex entry phrasing is direct about this outcome. If you touch the runes, the spirit within takes you inside. The interior of what appears to be a stone slab is, in some sense, an interior, a space. What that space contains and what happens to those pulled into it is not described because no record exists of anyone returning to describe it. This connects to a recurring motif in the franchise of surfaces that contain more than they appear to. The flat face of a painting, the smooth exterior of a stone, the ordinary appearance of an antique object in a room, any of these might be a threshold. Any of these might contain something that is aware of your presence on the other side. The world of Pokémon is full of surfaces that are not quite surfaces. Synestheia and Polteageist introduced a refinement to the ghost in an ordinary object category in the 8th generation, and the particular details of these entries reward close reading. Synestheia is a ghost inhabiting a teacup, floating in its own peculiar fluid in the cup, visible through the rim as a small shifting presence. The cup itself was not made for this purpose. The ghost moved in. What makes Synestheia lore specifically interesting is the question of authenticity. Certain Synestheia are found in antique cups of genuine provenance, and certain Synestheia are found in cups that were manufactured as counterfeits, decorated with marks that imply authenticity without possessing it. The ghost inside the cup does not know the difference. The ghost is the same in both cases. The distinction is entirely about the cup, and certain collectors who care very much about the cup are unwilling to accept a Synestheia from a counterfeit vessel despite the ghost being identical. This detail, which functions as a joke about antique collecting, also functions as a piece of world building that says something about how humans in the Pokémon world relate to the creatures they study and categorize. The ghost is not the variable that matters to these collectors. The container is. What lives inside the cup is secondary to whether the cup has the correct mark on its underside. The ghost in the antique teacup is, to the collector, a more interesting ghost than the identical ghost in the reproduction. The criteria for value are entirely human and entirely beside the point of what the ghost itself is. The concept of possession, of one entity inhabiting or overriding the presence of another, appears across the franchise in forms that range from the overtly sinister to the ambiguously neutral. Haunter is described as capable of licking a victim with a tongue that drains life force, and the Pokédex entries note that those touched by a Haunter's hands will shake without stopping until the end of their life, the tremors remaining as a permanent consequence of the contact. Gengar possesses shadows, Spiritomb possesses a keystone, Polteageist possesses a teapot, Cofagrigus possesses a sarcophagus. Each of these creatures has taken something that was not alive and made it the medium through which it now moves through the world. The object is the vehicle, the ghost is the passenger. The question of where the ghost resides when the object is destroyed or removed is not one the Pokédex addresses with consistency. Some entries suggest the ghost would simply find another host. Some suggest the destruction of the vessel means the end of the creature. The ambiguity is its own form of unease. The human ghost stories that underlie much of this design tradition deal with the same ambiguity. The ghost in the house is attached to the house, or to an object in the house, or to the memory of something that happened in the house, and the relationship between those possible attachments determines what happens when the house is demolished, or the object is removed, or the memory fades from the last person who carries it. Pokémon ghost lore borrows this uncertainty without resolving it, which is the most honest approach to ghost story construction available. In Pokemon Sun and Moon, after the main story is completed, a small optional area near a school becomes accessible at night. The area is empty by day in the usual way, but at night the music becomes a different quality, and a young girl appears, accompanied by a Drifloon, speaking in fragmented sentences about mysteries she has observed around the school grounds. She asks the player to investigate these mysteries, and the investigation takes the player through several locations that each reveals something strange. The mysteries themselves resolve into ordinary explanations with upsetting edges. A girl burning a love letter near the school at night, described by the ghost girl in terms that imply something far more alarming, is found to be exactly that and nothing more when examined. The ghost girl's fragmented language creates shadows that do not entirely belong to what is actually there. She is generating darkness with her syntax, with the gaps between her words, and the player follows those gaps into spaces that turn out to be less dark than the description suggested. But the final mystery is not resolved in the same way. The notebook in one of the school's classrooms contains entries in a child's handwriting. The child records seeing a hypno near the school several days before a new student arrived. 9 days after the new student's arrival, the notebook records that a Drifloon came to take the girl away. The next page, so where the next entry would be, has been torn out. The child who wrote the notebook stopped writing. The story the notebook was telling ends with a Drifloon arriving to take someone and a page that is no longer there. The ghost girl with the Drifloon companion stands in the school at night and speaks in fragments about mysteries. The janitor confirms the player was alone when he arrived. The page in the notebook is gone. The sequence of entries before the missing page describes exactly the pattern of events that would precede the ghost girl's current state, if the ghost girl's current state is what the evidence suggests it is. Dano, Zwilus, and Hydreigon form a dragon line whose lore involves a particular kind of internal chaos. Zweilous has 2 heads that operate independently and compete with each other for food, occasionally biting each other in the process. The 2 heads do not coordinate. They do not communicate. They exist in a state of perpetual conflict within the same body, each head acting on its own impulses without reference to the other. Hydreigon, the final form, has 3 heads, but the 2 additional heads on its wings do not have brains. The entries state this plainly. The wing heads cannot think. They bite because biting is what they do, operating on basic instinct without the cognitive involvement that the central head provides. The central head looks out from the form of a creature with 3 faces, 2 of which are not truly present in any meaningful sense, 2 of which are simply doing what they were made to do without anything behind the action. The entry that describes Hydreigon's temperament notes that it is ferocious and will attack anything that moves. It does not discriminate. It does not evaluate. It responds to motion with aggression as a consistent and invariable rule. This description, combined with the 2 wing heads biting and snapping independently of any central direction, creates a picture of a creature that is not exactly in control of itself, that has power distributed across forms that do not fully communicate, that attacks because attacking is what 3 heads without coordination do when something moves in front of them. The Muriani and Toxapex line in the 7th generation introduced lore that is notable for its directness. Muriani feeds on Corsola. The entries do not imply this relationship. They state it. Muriani specifically targets Corsola, biting off the coral branches that Corsola grows on its body, consuming them. The Corsola recovers by growing new branches, and the Muriani returns to remove them again. The cycle is documented in the Pokédex the way a naturalist would document a predator-prey relationship, and the Corsola line exists in a world where this cycle has been occurring for long enough to be considered ordinary. What makes this particular piece of lore worth noting is the companion entry for Corsola in the 8th generation. Galarian Corsola, the regional variant, is documented as a ghost type. The reasoning provided is that the ancient oceans around the Galar region changed in temperature, and the Corsola that lived there died off, unable to adapt. The ghost type Corsola that exists in the modern Galar region is what persists after that extinction event, the ghost of a species that was widespread and is now gone, except in this pale translucent form. Corsola, the evolution of Galarian Corsola, is described as having a core that contains the overflowing power of all the dead Corsola. The hollow shell is not the creature. The creature is what seeps through the gaps. Touch the shell, and you will be overwhelmed by the spirit inside. The entry describes this as a danger, not a threat, not aggression, simply what happens when the amount of accumulated grief and death compressed into a single form cannot contain itself when something makes contact. The Pokemon world handles the relationship between death and memory in a way that the franchise has never fully systematized, leaving the edges deliberately unclear and the implications open to interpretation. Some Pokemon remember their human lives and grieve them. Some Pokemon have no memory of what they were before. Some Pokemon were never human at all, but carry human grief within them, absorbed from the places or objects or people they were formed from. The category of memorial in the franchise is wide enough to include the Cubone who wears its mother's skull, and the Yamask who carries its own face, and the Phantump who cries in the voice of a lost child. All three of these are carrying something that once belonged to someone and now serves as the primary mark of what that creature is: the skull, the face, the voice. These are the tokens of loss made into identity, and the creatures who carry them are defined by carrying them in a way that makes the carrying seem impossible to set down. What the franchise has never done, and perhaps wisely, is resolve this. There is no quest that allows Cubone to remove the skull and grieve openly and move forward. There is no mechanic by which Yamask can be reunited with the person whose face it carries. The loss is the condition. The carrying is the creature, and the game goes on, and the player uses these creatures in battles and in contests and in all the ordinary processes of the game, and the weight inside each of them remains unacknowledged in the mechanics while remaining completely visible in the text. Galar's darker lore is concentrated in the wild area and the legends surrounding the Darkest Day, an event in the region's ancient history when a vast darkness spread across the land, and the sky and the Pokémon that inhabit the region transformed into something larger and more dangerous. The records describe it as a catastrophe that was ended only when two ancient heroes used legendary weapons to call the legendary wolves of the region and harness their power against the dark. What the lore does not entirely explain is the nature of the darkness itself. The Darkest Day is described as emanating from a specific location, connected to a specific Pokémon, but the description of what the darkness was, what it did to the creatures it touched, what it would have done if it had not been stopped, remains partly obscured. The entries offer outcome and implication rather than direct description. The world was going to end. It did not end. The reason it did not end is documented. The reason it was ending is somewhat less clear. Eternatus, the Pokémon at the center of the Darkest Day lore, arrived from space, and its body contains the energy that powered the darkness. It feeds on the energy in the region and releases it in transformed and unstable forms, and the creatures exposed to this energy become larger and more powerful and less controllable. The relationship between Eternatus and the Pokémon world is parasitic in the largest sense, an entity from outside the ecosystem arriving and drawing from it at a scale the ecosystem was not designed to accommodate. Duskull has an expression in its design that is benign, the single red eye visible through the skull mask, suggesting curiosity more than menace, and the Pokédex entries use this visual warmth as a setup. The entries note that Duskull likes the crying of children, not as a curiosity or an ambient sound. It seeks out the crying of children specifically, drawn to it the way other creatures are drawn to food or warmth. The entries say that it will chase a child who is crying until dawn. The image of something following a crying child through the night until the sky changes is uncomfortable in a specific way, and the discomfort is amplified by the visual of the creature involved. Well, Duskull does not look like a pursuer. It looks like something a child might draw, round and simple, and wearing a skull that is too large for its body in the way children draw skulls, inexactly but recognizably. The entry places that drawing in the dark behind a crying child and follows it until morning. Dusclops, the evolved form, generates a different kind of concern. Its body is described as hollow, and the hollow is compared to a black hole. Anything that approaches the opening too closely is drawn in and vanishes. The entries note that even people have been pulled inside, and that nothing has come back out of the space within Dusclops that anyone is aware of. The creature absorbs what comes near, and the hollow does the absorbing without any apparent intention. It is a mechanism, not a hunger. The mechanism functions regardless of what enters it. The creature known as Absol has been part of the franchise since the third generation and has spent its existence being misunderstood in a way that the Pokédex entries treat as genuinely tragic. Absol is a dark type that appears before disasters occur. It runs to human settlements when catastrophe is imminent, trying to warn them. The settlements see an Absol arriving and interpret its presence as the cause of the disaster rather than the herald of it, and so Absol is driven away or hunted, and the disaster arrives anyway without anyone having understood what the warning was. The entries note this misunderstanding across multiple generations, with a consistency that suggests the cycle has repeated without resolution. Absol arrives. Humans panic. Humans blame Absol. The disaster comes. Absol departs. Next time a disaster approaches, Absol arrives to warn again. The entries describe this as the Pokemon's purpose, something it does not choose but simply is, drawn to the places where harm is approaching before it arrives. What this creates is a creature that is always in the wrong place, at the wrong time, through no fault of its own, that has been persecuted for something it is, not something it does, across all of documented history in the Pokemon world. It is not malicious. It is not causing the disasters. It arrives before them because something in its nature allows it to sense what is coming. And the response of the humans who see it is to make the Absol itself the enemy, to chase away the warning and face the disaster without preparation and call the Absol the cause of what follows. The lore surrounding Mega Evolutions, introduced in the 6th generation, contains elements that the games treat primarily as empowerment mechanics, but that the Pokédex describes in terms that press against that framing. The entries for certain Mega Evolved forms describe the transformation as something the Pokémon does not entirely control, or does not entirely choose, or experiences in a way that is not simply enhancement. Mega Garchomp's entry describes the transformation as putting the Pokémon in a state of constant pain that it expresses as aggression against everything in its environment. The power increase is real, and the cause is real, and both are connected. The creature is more powerful because it is suffering, because the transformation produces a state that cannot be discharged except through violence. The player uses this. The mechanic is powerful and useful in competitive contexts, and the game provides it as a tool. The Pokédex entry is in the same game, describing what the tool costs the creature using it. This disconnect is not unique to Mega Garchomp. Several Mega Evolution entries describe states of reduced consciousness, instinct overwhelming cognition, the higher functions of the Pokémon submerged beneath the power surge. The creature that returns when the battle ends is not quite the same as the creature that was sent forward. What changed during the Mega Evolution, and whether it changes back entirely, is not something the entries address with completeness. Nightshade is a move in the Pokemon games that deals damage equal to the user's level, and in certain older games, the animation shows a shadowy duplicate of the target appearing before the attack connects. The move itself is unremarkable mechanically. The name and visual suggest ghost-type flavor that makes sense within the broader aesthetic of the games. But the Pokédex entries for the Pokémon associated specifically with Shadow and Shade carry implications that the move name only gestures toward. Gengar's ability to disguise itself as a person's shadow is documented. The shadow walking alongside you may not be yours. The shadow that moves when the light changes may be moving because something inside it is moving, not because the angle of the sun has shifted. The Pokemon world's relationship to shadows as distinct entities with potential independent residence is one of the threads that runs through the ghost-type category and surfaces in various entries without being fully systematized. What it would mean to live in a world where the shadow behind you might be inhabited, where the darkness attached to your form by the presence of light might be tenanted, is a question the franchise places in the background of its world without making central. The implication accumulates across entries into something that the player occasionally remembers when walking through an area at night in the game, when the music changes quality, when the light in the location dims slightly, and something appears in the dark at the edge of the screen that was not there before. The Pokemon known as Giratina exists in two forms: its altered form, in which it takes in the ordinary world, and its origin form, which it takes in the distortion world, a dimension that exists as a reversed and impossible mirror of the world the player navigates. The lore establishes that Giratina was banished to this reversed world after displaying violent behavior before the age of humans, sent there by a force the game identifies as the original creator of the Pokemon world, the Alpha Pokemon Arceus. The distortion world was not made for Giratina. The entries suggest that it exists independently of Giratina as a necessary complement to the ordinary world, maintaining the antimatter or negative space that the ordinary world's existence requires. Giratina was placed there in a world that was already strange and made the best of the arrangement. The world it inhabits became its world, and the form it wears in that world is not the form it shows when it passes through to the ordinary one. What this implies about the nature of the distortion world is left deliberately unclear. Is it a prison because Giratina is in it, or was it always a prison, and was Giratina sent there because it fit the prison rather than because the prison was made for it? The entries suggest the former, but leave room for the latter, and the further implication that the world the player walks through requires a reversed negative space complement in order to exist, that underneath the ordinary world there is something like the distortion world running in the opposite direction, is the kind of detail that sits quietly in the background of the franchise's cosmology and deepens considerably when examined. Aegislash's lore, briefly touched on earlier, extends into the question of influence and control. The entries describe Aegislash specifically as a Pokémon that can detect the aura of a person's leadership potential, and that in ancient times it used this detection to choose which rulers to follow. Kings who were followed by an Aegislash were understood to be legitimate rulers, and the creature's presence was itself a mark of authority that others recognized. What this implies is that Aegislash was not simply a weapon, it was a credential. It was an authenticator of power, and the power it authenticated was the power it had also, in some sense, conferred by choosing. A king followed by an Aegislash had been selected. The selection influenced how others treated the king. The king's power, in part, derived from being the one the Aegislash had chosen to follow. and the Oigislash was making these choices based on criteria it carried internally, a sensitivity to leadership potential that had no human equivalent. The question of what Aegislash wanted, what it received from this arrangement, what it was doing across the centuries during which it followed and evaluated kings and directed its sword and shield at whatever threatened the ones it had chosen, is not answered by the entries. It is a creature with ancient purpose and vast knowledge and an agenda that is entirely its own and does not need to be explained to anyone. As the night deepens and the details accumulate into something like a picture, it becomes clear that the Pokemon world is not a simple place. It is not dark in the way a horror story is dark, constructed with the intention of frightening, built around a monster with motivation and a protagonist with something to lose. It is dark the way a world is dark, naturally and without commentary, the way creatures and places and events carry weight because they are real within the frame of the thing, because the Pokédex writes about Yamask weeping and Phantump crying and Cubone running in the moonlight with the same tone it uses to describe habitat and diet and height. The darkness in the Pokemon world is incidental to the purpose of the records that contain it. The Pokédex is not a horror anthology. It is a natural history, and natural history contains these things. It contains creatures that cause harm, and creatures that were harmed becoming something new. It contains places where the rules are different, and objects that are more than they appear, and songs that should not be listened to all the way through. It contains ghost types, which are, in the framework of the franchise, a category of creature that exists because something did not finish. What the franchise has created across its decades of entries and games and regions is a world that takes seriously the idea that the world contains more than what is immediately visible. That behind the cheerful surface of a balloon floating near a playground is something that grabs and lifts and carries away. That behind the empty eyes of a stuffed creature moving through tall grass is a history that goes back further than the encounter. That in the dark corner of the abandoned house, something is sitting at a table, and when you come close enough, it leaves the table and moves off screen, and you are left with the chair and the table and the room and the music. These details were placed there deliberately by people who understood that a world feels real when it contains the things real worlds contain, the parts that are not resolved, the parts that were not finished, the parts that went somewhere and did not come back. The Pokemon world is enormous, and it is warm, and it is full of color and music, and the particular joy of finding a creature in the tall grass that you did not expect, and deciding to keep it. And it is also full of the other things, the things that are harder to name and harder to leave behind once you have read them. The entries are still there, in the games, in the databases, in the memories of anyone who paused long enough to read slowly. The Yamask carries its face, the Phantump calls out, the Gengar waits in the shadow that looks like yours, and the night, wherever you are listening from tonight, is exactly as long as it needs to be. The concept of a Pokemon existing purely as sound deserves its own quiet consideration. Misdreavus is a ghost type that floats through the night and feeds on the fear and sorrow of others, growing stronger as those around it become more distressed. The entries describe it as crying out in the darkness in a way that startles those who hear it from sleep, and the startle itself is part of the feeding. The cry creates the fear. The fear sustains the creature. The cycle is self-contained and does not require a target to remain still. What the Misdreavus entries add to this is specificity about what it collects. The creature is said to absorb the fear and sorrow into the round red gems on its neck, storing what it has gathered in those beads the way other creatures store food or warmth. The necklace of horrors, as it might be called, is not decoration. It is a larder. Everything the creature has gleaned from the sleeping and the startled and the grieving is there, contained in the red around its neck, visible to anyone who looks. Mismagus, the evolution, takes these abilities further and adds a dimension of deliberate construction. It recites incantations that can, depending on the composition, bring either happiness or misery to those who hear them. The entries note that most incantations are used to bring about the darker outcome, not because the creature is malicious by nature, but because the spells that produce misery come more naturally to it, the way some instruments some are better suited to minor keys. The happy spells exist. They are simply not the ones Mismagus reaches for first. Honchcrow is a dark flying type and has entries that describe it as maintaining a large group of Murkrow that it commands with authority. This is not unusual for a bird Pokemon with a boss aesthetic. What makes the Honchcrow entries worth a second reading is the descriptions of what happens to Murkrow who fail. The entries state plainly that a Honchcrow that is disobeyed will not let the matter pass. The consequences for disobedience are documented as severe, and the Honchcrow's memory for these slights is described as long and exact. The Murkrow that follow Honchcrow through the night sky are not following casually. They are following because the alternative to following has been made clear to them. The hierarchy is maintained through a combination of the Honchcrow's charisma, which the entries acknowledge, and the certainty of consequence, which the entries also acknowledge. The dark type aesthetic of the franchise often involves this kind of arrangement. Creatures that operate within structures that look organized from a distance and reveal their nature only when examined closely. What makes this worth noting alongside the more supernatural entries is the way it describes power operating in the Pokemon world through mundane mechanisms. Not all darkness is ghostly. Not all unease comes from the supernatural. Some of it is simply the arrangement of things, a large bird that commands smaller birds and does not forget, and the smaller birds flying in formation against the night sky, performing their loyalty in the one way that is available to them. Spiritom's number is notable in a specific and satisfying way. The 408 spirits bound into the keystone are documented with a precision that implies counting. Someone, at some point in the history of the Pokemon world, counted. The spirits were not described as many, or as countless, or as a multitude. They were described as 408, a specific quantity, suggesting a registry of some kind, a record maintained at the time of the binding that documented each spirit by name or nature before they were combined. The binding itself must have been an event. The records do not describe it, but the result requires the imagination to supply what is missing. 408 separate entities of various origins being gathered and combined into a single keystone, the ceremony required, the scale of the magical or spiritual work involved, the question of whether the entities cooperated with the process or whether they were brought to it without consent. The keystone the player encounters in the game is the outcome of this event, 500 years in the past by the time of the 4th generation games, still occupied. What the 500 years of solitary confinement have done to the 408 is a question the entries do not address. The spirits were malicious at the time of binding, which is why they were bound. Whether 5 centuries of close proximity to each other, unable to leave the stone, have changed them in any direction is left open. They are still described as causing mischief when encountered. Whether mischief is what remained after 5 centuries of compression, or whether something more coherent emerged from that long enforced intimacy, is not determined by any available record. The Pokemon known as Sableye was introduced in the 3rd generation and occupies a space in the franchise that is unusual because it had, at the time of its introduction, no type weakness. Dark type and Ghost type together, before the Fairy type was introduced in the 6th generation, produced a creature that could not be hit for super effective damage by any available type. The lore surrounding Sableye is consistent with this untouchable quality. The entries describe Sableye as living deep in caves and feeding on gemstones, the minerals accumulating in its body and eventually forming the crystals visible in its eyes and embedded in its chest. The gems in its eyes are described as functioning as receptors that can see into spiritual realms. The eyes glow in the darkness of the caves where Sableye spends its existence, and the entries note that those who encounter the glowing eyes in the dark have been known to become unable to sleep afterward, the vision of the light in the dark remaining with them in a way that sleep cannot displace. Mega Sableye's entries add to this. In its mega evolved state, it hides behind an enormous red gem, using the gem as both shield and weapon. The entries describe the creature using this gem to absorb the light around it, creating a local darkness that it inhabits and maneuvers within. The gem that was always there, the gem that its eyes could see into the spirit world through, becomes in its larger form the architecture of the darkness it prefers. Darkrai's connection to the concept of nightmare is worth examining from a different angle than its lore usually approaches. The creature is not a dream. It is not itself a nightmare exactly. It is a generator of nightmares, a catalyst that transforms ordinary sleep into something that cannot be controlled and cannot be escaped while it persists. The nightmares it generates are the product of its presence rather than its intention, which is a distinction the entries make carefully. What this means in practice is that a person sleeping near Darkrai is not being targeted. They are experiencing the ambient effect of what Darkrai is. The creature does not choose to give them nightmares the way a person might choose to tell a frightening story. The nightmares arise from proximity, the way cold arises from proximity to ice. The entries note that Darkrai knows what it does to those around it and retreats to isolated places to avoid causing this effect to people. The isolation is self-imposed and described as deliberate. Darkrai is aware that it is dangerous to the sleeping. It knows that the nightmares are its effect, and it chooses to live in places where it will not harm people through its mere presence. The entry that establishes this is one of the franchise's more direct statements of a creature living with the knowledge of what it is and choosing to protect others from that knowledge by removing itself from their vicinity. The nightmare does not want to give nightmares. It lives alone so that it cannot. The 5th generation games introduced a Pokémon called Golurk, a giant automaton of ancient construction, and the lore surrounding it touches on questions of purpose and origin that the entries answer partially and leave partially open. Golurk is a giant clay robot, created in ancient times by an ancient civilization for a purpose the records describe as protecting people and Pokémon. The civilization that made Golurk is gone. Golurk is still active. The entries note that there is a seal in Golurk's chest, and that if this seal is removed, the energy inside Golurk becomes unstable and the creature rampages. The seal contains what is inside. The seal was placed there by the civilization that no longer exists, and Golurk continues to move through the world, protected by a seal maintained by no one currently alive, fulfilling a purpose established by people who have been gone long enough that their records are incomplete. The image this creates is of a vast and ancient guardian whose instructions remain but whose commanders are absent, continuing to operate in a world that has moved on without it, carrying a mandate that no longer has an issuing authority, sustained by a seal that holds because it was well made, and not because anyone is actively maintaining it. When the seal fails, and the entries suggest it can fail, what is inside Golurk is powerful enough to cause catastrophic damage. The ancient civilization made something larger than their need and did not leave instructions for what to do if it outlasted them. The Pokémon franchise has visited the question of what happens to human consciousness in the presence of overwhelming psychic power through several different entries, but the most sustained examination of this question is arguably found in the lore around the Ultra Beasts. These creatures arrive from ultraspace, a dimension that exists adjacent to the Pokemon world through structures called ultra wormholes, and the entries that describe them are consistently careful to note that they do not obey the same rules as the creatures native to the world. Nihilego is an ultra beast that resembles a jellyfish and is described as possessing people, or in certain contexts attaching to people and stimulating the production of toxins that alter the host's behavior. The entries note a researcher in the Alola region who came into contact with Nihilego and was profoundly affected by the experience, describing the sensation in terms that suggest the boundary between the researcher's consciousness and the Ultra Beast's influence became unclear for the duration of the contact. The particular quality of Nihilego's possession is described as not entirely unpleasant for the host. The stimulation of certain neurological responses produces feelings of capability and power and disinhibition. The host becomes more aggressive and more reckless and more willing to do things they would not otherwise do, and they experience this transformation as liberation rather than invasion. This makes Nihilego more effective as a parasite and more difficult to dislodge because the host is not necessarily inclined to seek removal of something that feels like an enhancement. The location in the Alola games, known as the Ruins of Conflict, the Ruins of Life, the Ruins of Abundance, and the Ruins of Hope, each contain a legendary Pokémon associated with one of the guardian deities of the islands. These ruins are among the oldest structures in the region, predating the arrival of humans from outside. The Pokémon that are honored in these ruins are described as the reason the Alola region has been able to sustain human life, protecting the islands from external threats and maintaining the balance of the ecosystem in ways that the natural world alone could not. The Tampus, as these guardians are called, are not uniformly gentle. Their protection is described in terms that include both gift and threat. Tapu Fini, for example, is said to generate mist that causes those who wander into it to encounter illusions of their deceased loved ones. The encounter is not described as malicious. The mist is a natural production of the creature, but those who encounter the illusions do not always respond well to what they see, and the entries suggest that prolonged exposure to the mist can lead to loss of the will to continue. The person remaining in the mist, because the illusion of what they lost is preferable to the reality of continuing without it. The Tapu does not prevent people from entering the mist. It generates the mist as naturally as other creatures generate heat or sound. What the mist does to the people who enter it is not Tapu Fini's concern in any morally legible sense. The entries describe this without judgment. The guardian of the sea creates a mist. The mist shows you you're dead. What you do with that vision is your own. Drifblim is the evolution of Drifloon, and while Drifloon's lore about carrying children has been examined, Drifblim adds a piece of information that extends the picture into something larger. Drifblim is described as a massive balloon that drifts on the wind and has been known to carry groups of people away without any apparent difficulty. The entries note that groups who have grabbed onto Drifblim, hoping it would take them somewhere, have vanished, that neither Drifblim nor those it carried have been seen again. The entries do not specify where Drifblim goes. They describe the direction as away, which is precise enough to be alarming and vague enough to resist closure. Drifblim does not have a destination that has been determined by anyone currently alive. It drifts on thermal currents and follows patterns that are its own, and those who are with it when it departs are simply no longer present in the records. The groups who vanished are not described as having come back. They are described as having gone. The scale of Drifblim compared to Drifloon makes the single-child lore of the pre-evolution look contained in retrospect. The smaller creature carries individual children. The larger creature drifts across the skies with groups, and groups have held on, and groups have not been seen after the holding on. This is the natural progression of the line, and the entries presented as such, one stage carrying one person, the next stage carrying several, the destination in both cases unknown. The lore surrounding Darkround in its various entries, and the parallel lore of light as presented through Pokemon like Xerneas and Solgaleo, suggests that the Pokemon world has a mythology of fundamental forces that precedes the existence of individual creatures. The franchise occasionally pulls back the visible layer of the world, the roots and cities and tall grass, to show a cosmology beneath, a structure of light and dark and time and space and life and death that the individual Pokemon and individual trainers are embedded within without always being aware of. The legendary Pokemon that represent these forces are not simply powerful. They are described in many entries as having an existence that is qualitatively different from the creatures around them, as having been present before the world took its current shape, as carrying within them things that the world requires in order to continue. Yveltal, the destruction Pokemon, will absorb all life energy when its own life ends, and everything that life energy was taken from will be transformed into stone. The entries note that Yveltal then sleeps as a cocoon and eventually revives. The cycle this describes is enormous in its scope. A creature carries within it the capacity to end all life as a terminal function of its own life cycle. It is not malicious. This is what it does. And the world continues because Yveltal revives, because the cocoon phase produces a rebirth, because the destruction is part of a cycle that includes the continuation. The horror and the reassurance are inseparable, built into the same entry. The Pokemon called Jirachi has a specific and melancholy piece of lore that sits quietly within its overall mythology of wish granting. Jirachi is said to wake for 7 days once every 1,000 years, and during those 7 days, it can grant wishes to those who write them on notes attached to its body. The 1,000-year sleep is not a choice, it is the condition. Jirachi sleeps for 1,000 years, because that is how long it takes for enough energy to accumulate for 7 days of wakefulness. What this creates is a creature that is present in the world for 7 days every 1,000 years, surrounded by everyone who has waited for it or happened to encounter it, handling every wish it can manage in that narrow window, and then returning to a sleep that will last until everyone who met it this time is gone. The people who encounter Jirachi in any given 7-day period, and the people who encounter it in the next 7-day period, are separated by 1,000 years. The wishes granted in one waking are made by people who are not alive in the next. The entry does not say how Jirachi experiences this. It does not say whether the creature is conscious during the 1,000-year sleep, whether time passes for it the way time passes for the world around it, whether the 7 days of waking feel long or short from the inside. It documents the cycle and the mechanism and leaves the interiority of the creature to the imagination of whoever is reading. The wish-granting Pokemon that wakes for 7 days every 1,000 years is beautiful and strange, and the specific mathematics of its existence, 1 in every 1,000, 7 in every 1,000, are the most intimate detail the entry provides. In the framework of the franchise's cosmology, death and the journey after it are handled through the presence of creatures that serve as guides. Giratina is sometimes described in this role as a guardian of the boundary between the living world and what lies beyond it, though the entries on this point are less explicit than the entries describing its exile and its behavior in the distortion world. The relationship between the Pokemon world and whatever comes after it is one of the franchise's most carefully maintained ambiguities. What is clear is that the franchise does not treat death as an ending in any simple sense. The ghost types exist as evidence of this. The Pokemon world after death is not void. It is populated. It has rules. Certain creatures move between it and the living world, and others cannot make that crossing. The beings that remain on the living side in ghost form are those for whom the crossing was incomplete, for whatever reason, and the beings that assist crossing are among the most powerful and most ancient in the franchise's mythology. Celebi travels through time and is described as appearing in forests it will inhabit in the future, as well as forests it has already visited. It is present across multiple points in time simultaneously, or rather, its presence echoes across time in a way that makes the linear sequence of its experience something other than what the word linear implies. Whether Celebi experiences these visits sequentially or simultaneously or in some other way entirely is not something the entries address. It moves through time because that is what it does, the way Jirachi sleeps for 1,000 years, because that is what it does, and the specifics of what that movement feels like from the inside remain unavailable. The franchise returns regularly to the theme of human greed and technological overreach, producing consequences that the humans involved did not anticipate and could not contain. The backstory of Mewtwo is perhaps the most famous version of this theme, a genetically engineered creature created from the fossilized DNA of Mew through a process that the entries describe as years of hideous gene splicing experiments. The scientists involved pursuing capability without considering what would emerge when capability was achieved. Mewtwo's entries describe a creature in permanent pain and fury, its artificial origin producing a psychic power that exceeds anything the scientists who created it had modeled. The facility where it was created was destroyed. The records of what was done there survived in fragments. Mewtwo survived completely, carrying within it the full weight of what was done to bring it into existence, and the entries suggest it has not found a way to process that weight into anything other than rage and the desire to be alone. The specific cruelty of Mewtwo's situation is that it did not choose to be created. It did not choose the experiments. It did not choose the result. It was brought into existence through a process designed to produce a weapon, and the weapon did not want to be a weapon, and the facility that made it is rubble, and Mewtwo moves through the world carrying the capacity for destruction alongside the memory of what was done to produce that capacity, and the entries do not offer resolution to this arrangement. The creature simply is what the experiments made it, and the experiments are over. Necrozma, introduced in the 7th generation's expanded mythology, is a creature of light that has had its light taken from it. The entries describe an ancient form that was made of light, that lived in another dimension, that shone and shared that light freely, and that was shattered at some point in a conflict that the current entries do not fully describe. The form the player encounters is a fragment of the original, covered in a dark armor it created from its own body to protect the cracks where the light leaks out. What Necrozma craves is light, and the methods by which it obtains light are described in terms that resonate with the taking by force that comes from desperation rather than malice. It absorbs light. It uses other Pokémon as vessels for the light it contains, the fusions it can enter into allowing it to access more light than it carries alone. In its most complete form, its ultra form, it resembles what it once was before the shattering, and the entries suggest that form represents something like the creature's original state, what it was before the conflict, before the cracking, before the dark armor. The tragedy in Necrozma's lore is the transformation from something that gave light freely into something that takes light by force. The shift from generosity to necessity is not a moral failing in the creature. It is the consequence of a wound. What was damaged in the ancient conflict produced a need that cannot be quietly contained, and the darkness of the armor and the consuming behavior are the visible residue of something that once shone without cost, and now cannot do so without taking from somewhere. As these details come together over the long quiet of this particular night, What emerges is not a picture of a dark world, but a picture of a whole one. The Pokemon franchise has always been committed to a specific kind of completeness, a determination to include in its world everything that a world contains, the beautiful and the strange and the things that do not resolve, and the things that happened long ago and left marks that are still visible. The ghost types are not there to frighten. They are there because a world that takes itself seriously includes what is left behind. The legendary Pokemon, with their enormous and often tragic lore, are not there to intimidate. They are there because a cosmology requires forces, and forces have histories, and histories contain the parts that did not go well alongside the parts that did. The details that accumulate into the feeling of this kind of night, the entries read slowly in a quiet room, the gradual awareness that the world of Pokemon contains more than the maps suggest, are the details that make the world worth inhabiting imaginatively for as long as the franchise has held its audience. They are the weight beneath the lightness. They are the reason the lightness works. The Yamask carries its face through the dark. The Phantump calls in the voice of the child it used to be. Gengar waits in the shadow that follows you down the hallway, and you might never notice, and that is fine. The night is wide, and the world is full, and the details are there whenever you are ready to look at them. Sleep well. The Pokemon known as Reuniclus presents a different kind of unsettling fact, one that emerges from the biology rather than the mythology. It is a psychic type that encases itself in a green fluid, and this fluid is described in the entries as amplifying its psychic power significantly. The fluid within which Reuniclus floats is not simply a protective medium. It is a cognitive enhancement, a substance that makes the creature's already formidable mental abilities more powerful simply by surrounding it. The entries note that if two Reuniclus hold hands, their mental power becomes stronger still. The image of two creatures floating in their respective green fluids, extending their arms through the surfaces of their enclosures to make contact with each other, using that contact to multiply what each of them carries separately, is a strange and affecting one. The entries do not explain what the two creatures experience when this contact occurs, whether the amplification comes with a qualitative change or simply a quantitative one, whether the minds that touch through that connection remain distinct or blur into something shared. What Reuniclus adds to the larger picture is a reminder that the uncanny in the Pokemon world is not limited to the dark type and the ghost type and the legendary tier. It is distributed through the ordinary creatures of the world, present in the biology of creatures that look gentle and float placidly and hold each other's hands in the tall grass, while their combined psychic power reaches something that the entries describe, but do not quantify in any way that makes it feel bounded. The entries that describe these creatures were written to be read, and the reading of them, slowly and carefully, reveals the texture of the world they inhabit. That texture is not simple. It was never meant to be. It was made to hold everything a world holds, and it does. There is one more thread worth pulling, one more corner of the Pokemon world worth sitting in before the night fully settles. The creature called Marshadow exists in shadows, literally, slipping into the shadow of a person or a Pokemon and observing them from that vantage, learning their abilities through sustained proximity. The entries describe this as a learned skill and a natural behavior, the creature choosing to dwell inside the darkness that follows others rather than moving through the world under its own visible presence. What Marshadow observes while inside a shadow is not specified in full. It watches, it learns, it copies abilities it finds useful. Whether the person whose shadow it inhabits knows it is there, whether anything about the experience of being shadowed by a Marshadow is perceptible to the one being followed, is not established in the records. You could be carrying one. The shadow you cast might contain something attentive. The entries do not say this is likely. They say it is possible, and the Pokemon world, as this long night has established, takes the possible seriously in ways the ordinary world sometimes does not. There's a Pokemon called Deoxys, and what makes it unsettling is not what it does, but what it is. It is a virus. The entries describe it as having originated from a space virus that underwent a genetic mutation when it was exposed to a laser beam. The result is something that occupies the form of a Pokemon the way a foreign object occupies a wound, present and active, but not native, not of the world it inhabits. Its dull Na strand is visible, coiled around its core, and the core itself pulses with the energy that transformed it from one thing into this. What makes the Deoxys entries press harder than they might otherwise is the implication of origin. A virus from space underwent mutation and became something recognizable as a Pokémon. The categories of the Pokémon world absorbed it. The Pokédex assigned it a number and a height and a weight and a type. But the thing assigned those values is a mutation of something that predates the Pokemon world entirely, something that arrived from outside and was changed into something the world could catalog. What it was before the laser beam, the records cannot say. Deoxys changes forms in different games, and each form represents a different expression of the same core. One form prioritizes attack, one prioritizes defense, one balances speed above everything else. The forms do not feel like different Pokemon. They feel like different configurations of something that is still deciding what it is, something that has not yet settled into a single way of being and may not need to, something that the laser and the mutation gave form to without giving it finality. Spiritom's lore around the binding is worth approaching from a different angle than its origin. The keystone it inhabits was created by humans, placed in the hallowed tower, and sealed with what must have been considerable effort. 408 spirits of varying malice and various misdeed were gathered and combined into a single object through a process that someone designed and executed. The question of who did this and what they knew about what they were creating shapes the way the entry reads. The person or persons who created the spirit omb binding were working at a scale that is difficult to imagine casually. They knew what they were doing. They had a reason for binding these spirits together rather than dispersing them or destroying them, assuming destruction was possible. They chose this vessel, this keystone, this specific form of containment, and then they placed it in the hallowed tower, and the records of their identities and intentions were not preserved alongside the result of their work. 500 years later, a trainer inserts the keystone into a pillar on a foggy route and receives a visitor. The spirits inside do not remember who bound them, do not apparently distinguish between the person who placed them in the keystone and the person who releases them. The machinery of the binding holds them without explaining itself to them. What remains is the artifact, the creature inside it, and the gap where the intention used to be. Lunatone and Solrock are Pokémon that descended from meteors or arrived via meteor, and the entries describe them in terms that are consistently and deliberately alien. They were not discovered in the wild the way other Pokémon are discovered. They were found after a meteor impact, in the crater, as though the rock itself had opened, and these were what was inside. The entries note that people find them deeply unsettling to look at and cannot explain why, that there is something about the gaze of a Lunatone or a Solrock that produces unease in observers without apparent cause. The rock and psychic typing combination places them in a category that feels ancient rather than living. Rocks become fossils, and fossils become Pokémon, but that process involves restoration and revival. Lunatone and Solrock did not need restoration. They arrived. They were already what they are. The meteor was either their vehicle or their origin, and the entries do not specify which means the question of what kind of existence they had before the crater is open in a way that most Pokémon origin stories are not. The entries across several generations mention that the size of Lunatone's eyes changes with the phase of the moon. The eyes grow larger when the moon is full and smaller when the moon is dark. The creature is physically responsive to a celestial body, responsive in a way that is measurable and documented, and no explanation is provided for why this connection exists. It arrived from space, and it responds to the moon's cycles, and the relationship between those two facts is left for the reader to consider. 2. The Pokemon called Haunter occupies a specific and well documented position in the franchise's catalog of dangerous creatures, and the entries that describe it are among the more specific about the nature of the harm it causes. Haunter can pass through solid walls, which places it in a category of things that do not acknowledge physical barriers the way the world expects objects to. It moves through the game's architecture as though the architecture is not there, and this translates into entries that describe it appearing in places it should not be able to reach. The move Shadow Ball, associated strongly with ghost types, and particularly with the ghastly line, originates in entries that describe Haunter absorbing darkness from its surroundings and condensing it into a form it can throw. The darkness is not a metaphor. The darkness is a material. Haunter reaches into the ambient dark of whatever space it occupies and draws out substance that was previously invisible and forms it into something with mass and force. The entries do not explain where the darkness goes after the shadow ball is thrown and absorbed or dissipated. What makes Haunter's presence particularly worth sitting with is the progression of the line. Ghastly is described as nearly impossible to detect, a gas that is more presence than form, something that gathers rather than stands. Haunter has achieved distinctness, a shape, hands that can phase through walls and lick what they find. Gengar has achieved full solidity, or the appearance of it, a creature that casts a shadow of its own and smiles from the dark corner of the room. The progression from vapor to presence to solid thing with a smile describes a condensation of whatever ghost-type substance is made of, a process of becoming more concrete that ends at the Gengar stage with something that the world can no longer deny is there. The fourth generation of Pokémon introduced a set of creatures connected to the legend of the Sinnoh region's creation, and their lore is among the most cosmologically ambitious the franchise has produced. Dialga controls time, Palkia controls space, Giratina controls antimatter. Together with Arceus, the entries describe a creation event, a moment when the world was given its structure and its rules, and these creatures were integral to that structure. What the entries do with this cosmology is worth examining. Dialga's ability to control time means that the Pokémon world's timeline is not fixed in the way a reader of the games might assume it to be. It can be altered. The entries note that when Dialga uses its power, it can speed time up, slow it down, or reverse it entirely. This is described as a natural capacity of the creature, something it possesses the way other creatures possess speed or strength. That a creature with this capacity exists in the world, can be battled and captured and added to a trainer's party, means the timeline of every game that creature exists within is in some sense conditional. Palkia's spatial control creates a parallel condition. The spaces the player walks through, the routes and dungeons and towns, exist at the will of a creature that can warp spatial relationships whenever it chooses. The world the player inhabits is held in its current configuration by the stability of creatures that could reconfigure it. The lore presents this as stability rather than threat, the legendary creatures maintaining the world rather than threatening it, but the architecture of the maintenance is visible once the entries are read carefully. The Marowak ghost in Pokémon Red and Blue is one of the franchise's most quietly affecting narrative moments, and the details around it accumulate into something that feels genuinely earned. The player arrives in Lavender Town having been told that Team Rocket is using the Pokémon Tower for purposes other than its intended one. The tower is a burial place for deceased Pokémon, and the villainous organization has been operating there, using the sanctity of the burial ground as cover. The ghost that blocks the player's path will not fight the way wild Pokémon fight. It cannot be caught. The Sylph Scope, an item obtained by confronting the villain of the piece in another city, is required to see the ghost for what it is. With the scope, the ghost resolves into a Marowak, a mother who was killed by Team Rocket's operatives while defending her child. The child is Cubone. The child is the first Cubone the player encounters in the game, in the lower floors of the tower, grieving. The game does not tell the player all of this at once. It distributes the information across the region. The Cubone crying in the tower, the ghost that cannot be interacted with normally, the item that reveals identity, the battle that resolves into something the player is not permitted to win in the usual way because catching her is not the point. Laying her to rest is the point. The moment when the ghost is finally at peace and the path opens is the first time many players encountered something that felt like genuine grief in a video game, and it arrived in a children's game about collecting monsters. Drifblim carries its passengers to unknown destinations, and the entries that describe this do so with a restraint that amplifies rather than diminishes the impact. The phrase used in certain versions is that those who grab hold are taken away, and the entries do not say where. The restraint is the point. A complete description of a destination would close the question. The open destination keeps it alive. What makes Drifblim's entry complement Drifloon's so well is the scale. Drifloon takes children, Drifblim takes groups. The first is an individual tragedy. The second implies something larger. If groups have been taken by Drifblim and not returned, the records of those disappearances exist somewhere in the Pokémon world, were reported by someone, were investigated or not investigated, led somewhere or nowhere. The entries report the behavior without reporting the consequence chain. The consequence chain is left to whoever reads the entry and follows it with imagination. The balloon aesthetic that both creatures share is not accidental. The design language of Drifloon and Drifblim is deliberately cheerful, deliberately approachable, deliberately the kind of visual that a child in the Pokémon world would not know to be afraid of. The darkness is inside the cheerfulness, not instead of it. The thing that takes you away looks like a balloon. The thing that takes you away in groups looks like a bigger balloon. The size is the only visible difference. The destination is the same. There is a Pokémon called Phantump, whose voice, as described in the entries, was studied by scientists in the Pokémon world who wanted to understand what they were hearing. The entries record their conclusion plainly. The voice is the voice of a child. The cry that Phantump produces is not a random sound or an animal call or a tone generated by whatever biological mechanism the creature possesses. It is specifically and identifiably the voice of a lost child crying in a forest. The scientists who studied this reached their conclusion through comparison with recordings of children and through analysis of the specific frequencies involved. The entry reports this finding in the same register as any other finding, the weight of it absorbed by the flat documentation style that the Pokédex uses consistently. A team of scientists confirmed that the ghost-type creature wandering the forest sounds like a lost child. The entry continues. What this adds to the Phantump mythology is a verification layer. It is not the player's interpretation of the lore that the cry sounds childlike. The in-world scientists have confirmed it. The Pokémon world contains people who studied this sound carefully enough to verify its nature and recorded their findings, and the findings are there in the entry for anyone who opens it. The lost child is real enough for scientists to detect. The forest keeps what it takes. The Pokémon called Chepet has an entry that describes its relationship to negative emotion in a way that distinguishes it from other ghost types that feed on fear or sorrow. Shuppet is specifically drawn to the emotions of jealousy, spite, and resentment. It lingers outside windows at night, near places where those emotions are felt strongly. It points its horn toward houses where grudges are being held, drawn to the specific quality of those feelings the way a compass points north. The entries note that when a person's heart is full of spite, a Shupit will appear. Not when a person is frightened, not when a person is grieving, but when a person is nursing a grudge, turning a resentment over and over in the dark. The creature responds to that specific frequency of feeling, and its presence outside the window is the signal that the feeling has reached the threshold it requires. The person inside the house does not need to know that Shuppet is outside. The Shuppet does not need the person to know. What makes this entry specifically interesting is the precision of the emotion described. Fear and sorrow are large and general. Spite and jealousy and resentment are precise, are products of specific human relationships and specific perceived injuries. Shuppet is drawn to the interpersonal dark, to the small fierce grudges, rather than the large existential fears. The creature that appears outside the window of the person who cannot stop being angry at someone in their life is feeding on something remarkably specific, remarkably human, remarkably quiet. The 8th generation game Pokémon Sword and Shield introduced a region with its own specific mythology, and buried within that mythology are entries that describe what happened to the Pokémon of the Galar region when they died. Certain Pokémon in Galar do not simply cease to exist. Their energy, described in the game's internal lore as Dynamax energy, is absorbed back into the land, into the wishing stars that eventually fall as meteors and accumulate in the region's soil. The dead do not disappear. They become part of the ground. This creates a cosmology in which the land itself is haunted, not in the ghost-type sense, but in a more diffuse and geological sense. The soil of Galar contains the accumulated energy of everything that lived and died there since the Dynamax phenomenon began. Walking through the wild area, the player is walking through a landscape made partly of former life, and the Pokémon that Dynamax in that area are drawing on that accumulated energy to become temporarily enormous. The battles in the wild area are powered by the dead. The wishing stars that the children of Galar wish upon are also part of this cycle. They make wishes on meteors that contain the condensed energy of Pokémon that have passed, the wishes being addressed to the residue of something that was alive. The entry does not make this explicit, but the accumulation of lore around Eternatus and the wishing stars and the Dynamax energy points toward this reading and does not redirect it. Cursola's entry was briefly touched on earlier in the context of Galarian Corsola, but the specific phrasing of the entries around what Cursola contains deserves a slower reading. The creature's body is described as a shell, a container, and the core that seeps through the gaps is described as the accumulated spirits of every Corsola that died when the ocean warmed. Every individual death in that extinction event left something behind. Those somethings gathered, they gathered into what Cursola now is. The phrase overflowing power appears in the entries to describe what is inside. Not sufficient power, not adequate power, but overflowing. The container is not large enough for what was put into it. The shell that Cursola wears is straining. The spirit that seeps through the cracks is not a trickle. It is overflow from a vessel that was never designed to hold what history compressed into it. The crisis that killed the Corsola did not resolve into silence. It resolved into Cursola, and Cursola carries that crisis in a form that cannot be fully contained. Touching the shell triggers an immediate and overwhelming response from what is inside. The entry does not describe the person after this contact in terms that suggest they recover. It describes the experience as something that befalls them. The passive construction, the absence of agency, the descriptions of being overwhelmed rather than encountering. These grammatical choices in the entries are doing work that the facts alone would not do as efficiently. The writing of the Pokédex occasionally rises to the level of its subject matter, and this is one of those instances. Phoebe, the Elite Four member in the Hoenn region's Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, has a piece of story attached to her that was discussed at the opening of the original script but is worth returning to in a different register. The evidence that her grandmother's ghost remains at Mount Pyre after the events of the game is distributed across several interactions, and assembling it requires the player to be paying attention across multiple unconnected moments. The grandmother is present in the original games, standing with her husband at the summit of the mountain. In the remakes, after the Delta episode is completed, only the grandfather is at the summit. Phoebe can be found nearby, apparently speaking to no one, laughing at something no one else can see or hear. The specific content of what she is saying when the player approaches depends on what the player says. The grandmother is apparently responsive. She apparently has things to say about the player. She apparently has memories of them. The piece that makes this sequence land as it does is not any single interaction, but the accumulation of absences and presences. The missing grandmother, the solitary grandfather, Phoebe speaking to something invisible, the reference to what the grandmother said about the player. The trainer's eyes feature being used to frame the interaction. These pieces were placed at different points in the game, and they fit together only if the player follows each one. The ghost of the grandmother is built from inference and absence, which is perhaps the most accurate way to build a ghost. The concept of a Pokémon that is fundamentally incomplete appears most directly in the case of type, null, and its evolution. Sylvally, but the way it is incomplete is worth examining slowly. Type, null, was created by human scientists attempting to recreate an ancient Pokémon weapon by combining the genes of multiple legendary Pokémon into a single form. The result was a creature with abilities drawn from multiple sources, powerful beyond what any individual source could provide, and unstable beyond what any single containment measure could hold. The helmet type, null wears, is a limiter, not a protection. It is not protecting the creature from external harm. It is protecting the world from what the creature can do when the helmet is removed. The entries describe the helmet as weighing heavily on type, null as being a burden it carries constantly, and the creature is also described as highly aggressive, possibly because of the conflicting genetic instructions it carries from multiple legendary sources that were never meant to be combined. The helmet holds the aggression back, but still the aggression exists because of what the scientists did. Sylvally is what type, null, becomes when it trusts a trainer completely. The trust is the mechanism that breaks the helmet. The trust is the mechanic by which the limiter is removed, and the creature gains access to what it has always been capable of. What was created as a weapon by people who intended to use it as a weapon became something that chooses its allegiance through emotional bond rather than programming. The scientists did not design that. The entries suggest they did not anticipate it. The creature they made found something they were not looking for. Hoopa is a mythical Pokémon whose two forms represent two very different expressions of the same underlying nature. In its confined form, it is small and mischievous, described as having a fondness for bringing things through its golden rings from distant places, an inclination toward the surprising appearance of objects that should not be where they appear. In its unbound form, something older and larger and considerably more dangerous becomes visible. The unbound form entries describe a creature capable of bending dimensions, of connecting spaces that should not connect, of reaching through the world's fabric to seize what it wants from wherever it is. The playful mischief of the confined form is the same impulse, but the unbound form has the power to pursue it at a scale that the confined form cannot. The rings in the unbound form are larger. The reach is longer. What it can bring through those rings, and what it can do with what it has brought, is not bounded by the small scale of the confined version. The mythology around Hoopa in the sixth generation media suggests that its power was sealed away into the prison bottle after it caused damage that the records describe with specificity. It was bringing things through its rings that it should not have been bringing, reaching through dimensional fabric to take what caught its interest, regardless of whether taking it was appropriate. The sealing was not a punishment in the moral sense. It was a practical containment. The entity and its enthusiasms needed to be reduced to a manageable size. The confined form is the reduced version. The unbound form is what was being managed. The Pokémon known as Absol, revisited for a second look, carries something in its design that is worth noting alongside the lore. The blade-like structure growing from its head is described in certain entries as being sensitive to changes in the surrounding area, as functioning like a detection instrument rather than a weapon. Absol does not use this structure to attack. It uses it to know. The blade is a sensor for catastrophe, oriented toward whatever direction the coming disaster is approaching from. This creates a creature that is perpetually oriented toward disaster. Its body is organized around the detection of harm. The blade that looks aggressive is the instrument of warning, the visible part of the capacity that has made every interaction between Absol and human civilization a tragedy of misreading. The disaster detector looks like a weapon, the warning looks like a threat, and the creature moves through a world that has been responding to the appearance, rather than the reality, for the entirety of its documented existence. The entries note that Absol has become increasingly rare, which is presented as a direct consequence of the persecution. Populations that are hunted retreat and diminish. The creature that was trying to warn the settlements has been warned away from the settlements by the settlement's response to its warnings. The disasters that Absol could have predicted, the warnings it might have delivered, now arrive without herald, because the herald has been driven far enough away that by the time it arrives, the disaster is already happening. The misunderstanding has consequences that the misunderstanding cannot resolve. Volcarona is a firebug type introduced in the 5th generation, and its mythology is built around a specific historical claim made in certain entries. When an ice age came and covered the world in ash, the sun's light failed to reach the earth, and crops and warmth and the capacity for life diminished catastrophically. Volcarona, the entries say, took the place of the sun. It filled the sky with fire, and the fire replaced the light, and the world survived. The claim is remarkable in its scope. A Pokémon took the place of the sun, not metaphorically, not in a regional sense, but functionally, substituting for the primary source of light and warmth that the planet requires for life. The entries state this as historical fact, the same way they state anything. A long time ago, when the sky was covered and the sun was obscured, Volcarona was the sun for a while. Life continued. The creature the player encounters deep in Relic Castle is the descendant, or possibly the same individual, of this solar substitute. It is worshipped by certain traditions within the game's world as a deity, which is entirely consistent with what the entries describe it having done. The gap between the creature sitting at the bottom of a desert ruin and the creature that kept the world alive by substituting for a star is one of those gaps that the Pokédex papers over with flat tone and leaves to the reader to fill with appropriate weight. Xerneas, the life Pokémon of the 6th generation, holds a piece of lore that is often overshadowed by its counterpart Aviltal's more obviously alarming entries, but that is worth considering in its own register. Xerneas grants eternal life. The entries describe it as having given life to everything in the world once, and being capable of sharing eternal life to those it chooses. When its own life ends, it transforms into a tree and sleeps for 1,000 years before the cycle begins again. The entry that mentions what happens when Xerneas gives eternal life is careful about what it does not say. It says the creature shares eternal life. It does not describe the mechanism. It does not describe what eternal life looks like for the recipient, whether the recipient ages but does not die, whether they remain at the moment of receiving the gift, whether the gift can be refused or revoked, or whether it is given and becomes permanent regardless of whether the recipient wanted it. The gift is documented. The experience of receiving it is not. What the Xerneas entries create, when placed against the Yveltal entries, is a picture of two forces that are both in some sense absolute. Yveltal takes all life energy when it dies. Xerneas gives life that does not end. The two creatures share a region, and in the mythology of the 6th generation games, they represent a balance, but the balance is between two extremes that are both total, both without limit, both operating at a scale that individual lives cannot evaluate. The person who receives eternal life from Xerneas is now in a different category from every other living thing, and the entry does not ask whether they wanted to be there. Aegislash has been examined earlier in the context of its relationship to royalty, but there is a layer of that examination that was not fully developed. The entries state that Aegislash can detect a person's leadership potential, and that kings who were followed by an Aegislash were considered legitimately powerful. What this implies about the kings who were not followed by an Aegislash is worth sitting with. If the presence of an Aegislash conferred or confirmed legitimate power, and if Aegislash only aligned itself with those who genuinely possessed leadership potential by its own evaluation, then the political history of any region where Aegislash existed as an active presence contains a layer of creature-validated legitimacy. The king who did not attract an Aegislash was, by the implicit logic of the mythology, not the right king. The king who tried to acquire one by force was presumably not the kind of king the Aegislash would choose, and any force applied to the acquisition would have been measured against the creature capable of wielding both sword and shield independently. The entries do not describe what Aegislash does to a king it has rejected or to a pretender who has claimed a throne that Aegislash considers illegitimate. The entries describe what it does for the legitimate king. What it does to the other kind is the silence in the mythology, the negative space where the consequences of being on the wrong side of Aegislash's evaluation would reside. The sword judges. What happens to the judged is left open. The events surrounding the lake trio of the Sinnoh region, Uxie and Mesprit and Azelf, involve a mythology that connects these creatures to the origin of human psychology itself. The entries describe the three as having given specific qualities to human beings at the dawn of the world. Uxie gave knowledge, Mesprit gave emotion, Azelf gave willpower. Before these gifts were bestowed, the entries imply human beings existed in a form that lacked these qualities, a form that the reader is left to imagine. What the Lake Trio gave is not described as a small gift. Knowledge, emotion, and willpower are not additions to an already complete human form. They are described in a way that implies they were the essential contents, the things without which a person is not yet fully a person. The creatures residing in the 3 lakes of Sinnoh are the origin of human inner life. Every thought, every feeling, every act of determination is downstream of what 3 small Pokémon distributed at the beginning. The entries note that if these creatures disappeared, so too would the knowledge and emotion and will they represent. The world would not simply lose 3 Pokémon. The world would lose the internal equipment through which humans navigate it. This is the most extreme version of what it might mean for a Pokemon to be truly legendary, not powerful in a way that threatens from outside, but foundational in a way that cannot be removed without dismantling what was built on it. The Pokemon known as Marshadow inhabits shadows, moves through them, learns from them, and its entries contain one specific detail that is easy to overlook in the context of its other described abilities. Marshadow can copy the moves and power level of any Pokemon whose shadow it enters. It does not just observe, it replicates. The creature in the shadow becomes temporarily identical in capability to the creature casting the shadow, gains access to every move the creature knows, reaches the same level of power, and then the shadow moves on. What this means for any battle Marshadow engages in is that the strongest opponent Marshadow has previously shadowed is the floor of what Marshadow can become in that moment. If Marshadow has been inside the shadow of a legendary Pokemon, it has the capabilities of a legendary Pokemon available to it whenever those capabilities are needed. If it has been inside many shadows over a long life spent observing from the dark beneath other creatures, then the accumulated capability it has gathered is the sum of every shadow it has inhabited. The entries describe Marshadow as timid and generally reluctant to be seen, which creates an interesting dissonance between the capability described and the behavior exhibited. The creature that can become as powerful as whatever it has shadowed hides inside shadows and avoids notice. The hiding is either strategy or preference, and the entries suggest it as preference, that Marshadow watches from the dark because watching from the dark is what it prefers, that the capabilities it accumulates through observation are not something it deploys regularly, but something it possesses quietly. Palos and is a ghost ground type, introduced in the 7th generation, and its lore involves a mechanism that is specific enough to produce a clear and unpleasant picture. Palisand is a sandcastle haunted by a spirit that animates it, and the spirit is not content to simply be a sandcastle. The entries describe Palosan as luring small Pokemon and children toward it. The luring is not explained, but once the lured have come close enough, Palisand's sandy body grabs hold of them and pulls them under the surface. The entries continue. The life force is drained from whatever is pulled inside. The bones remain, buried in the sand beneath the castle form, adding structure to the castle's interior. Palossand is described as growing larger and more powerful as it buries and drains more victims. The sandcastle on the beach gets bigger because it has consumed more things. The children and small Pokemon drawn to it by whatever mechanism the luring involves become the architecture of the thing that drew them in. The Pokemon world contains many beaches in the tropical Alola region where Palisand resides. The beach is a location associated with recreation, with play, with the presence of children. Palossand exists in the beach context, looks like something built by children in play, and is described as targeting children, specifically alongside small Pokemon. The design is doing the same work that Drifloon's design does. The thread is built to look like the thing you reach for naturally. The backstory of Silvally, which was touched on earlier, contains an element that the entries approach from an unexpected direction. The creature that becomes Silvally when it trusts a trainer is in some entries described as having a will of its own that was not designed into it. The scientists who created Type, Null intended to create a weapon with specific controllable capabilities. What they got, the entries suggest, was something that developed an inner life through whatever process the combination of legendary genetics produced. The helmet was designed to limit the creature's capabilities. The creature was also, evidently, developing the kind of psychological complexity that allowed it to form an emotional bond with a human trainer, a bond that eventually provided the trust required to break the helmet. These two things coexist in the same creature. The limitation was necessary because of the power inside. The power inside was also generating the capacity for connection that would eventually remove the limitation. What this implies about the nature of the weapon the scientists created is that the weapon was developing in directions the scientists did not account for. The genetic combination they assembled was producing not just the capabilities they targeted, but something additional, something that the entries describe as will, as the ability to choose, as the foundation of the trust that unmakes the helmet. The scientists made something that was more than they made, and the more was what ultimately determined what the creature became. The Regi trio from the third generation, Regirock and Registeel, are ancient Pokemon sealed away by a civilization that is not identified by name in any entry the franchise has produced. The sealing mechanism is elaborate, involving a specific course of actions that the ancient civilization encoded in a ruined text that the player must decode to access the chambers where the Regi are held. The civilization knew what they were doing. They made the sealing difficult to undo on purpose. The question the entries do not answer is why. The civilization sealed these creatures away rather than destroying them, which implies either that destruction was not possible or that they considered it preferable to seal. The seals are meant to hold. The seals were placed by people who had a reason to place them. The creatures inside the chambers have been there long enough that the civilization that put them there is gone without a name or a record beyond the instructions for the sealing mechanism. Regigigas, added in the fourth generation as the master of the three, adds another layer. It is described as having pulled the continents into their current positions using only rope. The entries state this as geological history. The continent arrangement that the Pokemon World's maps show is the result of Regigigas doing it, pulling land masses around on the surface of the ocean until they sat where it wanted them. Then Regigigas was sealed in a temple. The creature that arranged the world's geography is in a frozen state in a cold room and has been there long enough for the world to forget it was ever arranged. The concept of a Pokemon that produces time paradoxes through its existence is explored with Celebi but finds its fullest and most unsettling expression in the Delta episode content of Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. The villain of that episode attempts to use a Pokemon to alter the history of the world by going back to a point before a catastrophe and preventing it, which would mean that the current timeline, including the villain's own existence, would not have occurred. The game engages with this paradox directly rather than avoiding it. The villain has thought through the implications and has decided that the paradox is acceptable, that preventing the catastrophe is worth the dissolution of the timeline that produced both the catastrophe and themselves. The willingness to unmake your own existence in order to prevent a disaster that you know about, only because you exist in the timeline where it occurred, is the kind of recursive logic that the Delta episode builds its entire dramatic structure around. The resolution involves Rayquaza and Deoxys and the player, and a legendary Pokemon capable of altering probability, and the timeline that the player has been in throughout both games is preserved. But the episode establishes that the preservation was not guaranteed. The timeline that the player inhabits throughout the Pokemon franchise is, within the logic of the 6th generation remakes, one of multiple possible timelines, and was in specific danger of being overwritten by someone who believed a different timeline would be better. The franchise went there, quietly, in an endgame episode, and the entries around it are written as though this is not exceptional. Spiritomb has one more detail that has not yet been addressed. The number 408 is not arbitrary. In certain traditional belief systems, particularly those connected to the cultural context from which the game draws much of its design language, certain numbers carry specific associations with misfortune, ill omen, or spiritual weight. The designers of Spiritomb chose a specific number and placed it in the entry, and the choice of that specific number was not random. The relationship between the number and its cultural associations adds a layer to the Spiritome entries that exists entirely outside the game's text, but is accessible to anyone who knows what the number is doing. The creature was made from a number that carries weight. The weight is not explained in the entry, it is assumed in the entry. The entry says 408 and moves on, and the reader who knows what 408 means in the relevant cultural context finds something in the Spirit Omb lore that the reader who does not know misses entirely. This kind of layered design, where the surface text is complete in itself but contains additional information for those who bring specific knowledge to the reading, is present throughout the franchise, but is unusually concentrated in the ghost type entries and the mythological entries. The franchise was made for a broad audience, but speaks to specific knowledge when specific knowledge is present, and the speaking is quiet, placed in the numbers and names and references, without announcement. The Pokémon called Dreepy is the first form of a dragon ghost type line introduced in the 8th generation, and its entries describe something about where it lives that adds a dimension to the ghost type category that most entries do not explore directly. Dreepy is described as inhabiting the same land it lived on when it was alive, in the prehistoric era, as a different creature. The land has changed, the sea level has changed. What was once coast is now inland. Dreepy haunts a geography that no longer exists in the form it would recognize. The entries note that Dreepy are too weak to do anything about this situation. They are small and not particularly powerful, and they wander the area that was once their habitat, the transformed landscape of what used to be their home. They cannot fight effectively. They cannot communicate what they remember. They drift through the contemporary geography of a place that was something different when they were alive, and the distance between what they remember and what is there is total. Dracloak, the middle evolution, is described as carrying a Dreepy on its head and training it, preparing the Dreepy for when it can survive on its own by incorporating it into its own activity. The relationship between Dracloak and Dreepy is protective in a way that does not have a name in the entries, but reads as a large ghost, looking after a small one, a creature that survived the transition to a form that can act, taking responsibility for one that has not yet reached that capability. The prehistoric origins make this paternalism between ghosts particularly strange. Both are ancient, both are from a world that is gone. One can function in the present world, and one cannot yet. As this long night continues its quiet unfolding, there are corners of the franchise that speak less loudly, but accumulate meaning through repetition. The Pokédex has been the primary record consulted across this journey, but the in-game events and the environmental storytelling and the character dialogue and the incidental books and papers left in houses and libraries contribute to a picture that the Pokédex entries alone cannot complete. The note in a child's room that describes strange sounds at night. The old man in the city who says he has not seen his wife in years and seems confused about why she is not there. The books in ancient libraries that describe events the scholars who wrote them clearly did not fully understand. The strange interactions that occur when the player stands still in certain locations at certain times of day. The music that changes quality in specific places without explanation. These are not Pokédex entries. They are details distributed through the games that the Pokédex does not cover, details that the world adds to itself around the edges. The world of Pokémon is large enough that it contains more than any single record can hold. The Pokédex is a tool and a starting point. What grows around the edges of that tool, in the environments and the conversations and the events that cannot be cataloged in a single entry, is the rest of the world, the part that behaves the way actual worlds behave, the part that does not announce itself, the part that the player walks through and occasionally stops in and finds that something is different from what it was the last time they came this way. The final thought that this particular knight wants to leave behind is about the nature of the catalog itself. The Pokédex is the instrument through which the Pokémon world is described, and it describes everything in the same register: the height and the weight and the behavior and the history and the danger, all of it in the same flat, careful voice that does not distinguish between the mundane and the extreme. A Pokemon that eats berries is described with the same prose as a Pokemon that absorbs souls. The creature that lives in alpine meadows and the creature that takes children away into the sky receive the same treatment, the same structure, the same font. The Pokédex is not a horror anthology. It is not trying to frighten. It is trying to document, and what it documents includes things that, removed from the catalog and placed in a different frame, would be understood differently. Removed from the catalog and placed here, in the dark, in the quiet, with nothing else to look at, they land differently than they do in the game. The game surrounds them with music and color and the momentum of play. Here they arrive one at a time, in sequence, in the stillness of whatever time it is where you are: the Yamask, the Phantom, the Chandelure, the Froslas, each one exactly as strange and as heavy as the entry makes it. The night is still. The world outside is the world outside. And the world of Pokemon, which has always contained more than a single playthrough reveals, is exactly as large and as dark in its corners and as complete in its strangeness as it has always been. The entries are there whenever you need them. The details are patient, they will wait. There is one more creature that deserves attention before this particular version of the night ends. Furfrou is not a ghost type. It is not a legendary. It is a normal type with an unusual characteristic, and the characteristic is this: it cannot be traded in its trimmed form. When a Furfrou is traded to another trainer, its trim, the elaborate groomed shape that the trainer gave it, reverts to the default. The styling does not transfer with the creature. Only the creature transfers, arriving in the new hands without the shape it had been given. The reason this detail belongs in this context is not the mechanics, it is the implication. The trim a trainer gives their Furfrou is a mark of care, of time spent, of attention. When the creature changes hands, that mark disappears. The new owner receives something that has been shaped by someone else's care and carries no visible trace of that shaping. The creature that was maintained and styled and given a particular form by its previous trainer arrives as though none of that happened. The history of care is not portable. This is a small detail and a quiet one, and it does not belong to the horror register that most of this night has occupied. But the Pokemon world is not only horror, it is also loss in small forms, the untransferable particularity of what one person does for a creature in their care. The trim fades, the creature remains. The relationship that produced the trim is over, and the new relationship begins from a default, and neither the creature nor the entries record what the trim looked like or what it meant to the person who gave it. The night, in whatever form it has taken wherever you are, does not require resolution. The entries that were covered here do not resolve either. The Yamask still carries the face. The Phantom still cries. The Gengar still waits in whatever shadow is available. These are facts about the world, distributed through a catalog that was written to be read, and the reading of them in the dark before sleep is one of the ways the world of Pokémon has been experienced by people who love it. What remains is the stillness, the way the details settle after they have been spoken, the way the strangeness becomes familiar through repetition, the way the familiar becomes something a little different when looked at slowly. The world of Pokémon has been doing this for a long time. It has been hiding things in plain sight, placing the extraordinary in the same entry format as the ordinary, trusting that the reader who looks will find what is there. There is also the matter of Sandygast, Pelosin's pre-evolution, which carries its own thread of lore that the full Pelosin discussion only touched at the edges. Sandygast begins not as a sandcastle, but as a small mound of sand, unremarkable on a busy beach, with a shovel stuck in it. The shovel is the entry point. Any person or Pokémon that grabs the shovel falls under Sandygast's control, becomes a vehicle for the creature's will, and is directed to add sand to the mound. The adding of sand by the controlled person or Pokémon is not described as anything the controller of the shovel experiences, as loss or invasion. The entry does not say the person feels afraid or confused or resistant. It says they add sand. The control is the behavior, not the internal experience. Whether the person knows what is happening to them while they are directed toward the mound with their hands full of sand is a question the entry sidesteps with characteristic efficiency. The shovel stuck in the beach sand looks like something a child left when they got tired and wandered off. It looks like a beach toy in a beach environment. The creature beneath it requires only that someone reach for the handle. The handle is there, sticking up, visible, easy to grab. Everything about the scene invites the grab. The entry records what happens after the grab and does not comment on the invitation.